Sometime in the second half of the 1st century, in a room we cannot locate, in a city we cannot name with certainty, a man sat down to write the most important opening paragraph in the history of Western literature, and he began it with a list of names that almost nobody would bother to read. The Gospel of Matthew does not open with thunder. It does not begin with poetry, or a philosophical declaration about the nature of light and darkness, or a heavenly voice cracking the sky. It begins, of all things, with a genealogy, a long, careful, relentlessly repetitive catalog of fathers and sons, stretching back 42 generations, connecting a carpenter from Nazareth to the throne of David, and, through David, all the way back to Abraham himself. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judah and his brothers. On and on it goes, name after name, the rhythm almost hypnotic, almost dull, the way a drum beat becomes invisible when it has been going long enough. Most modern readers skim it. Many skip it entirely. And in doing so, they miss the most subversive thing Matthew ever wrote. The man behind this gospel was writing to a Jewish audience. That detail changes everything about how his opening must be read. Matthew was not composing a general interest biography of Jesus of Nazareth. He was building a legal case. He was constructing, with the patience and precision of a scribe who understood that his readers would check every name, every link, every claim, a chain of evidence designed to answer the single most explosive question in the Jewish world: is this man the Messiah? And in 1st century Jewish life, that question was not abstract. It was political. It was military. It was the question that could bring down empires or raise them up, depending on where the answer landed. To understand what Matthew buried inside that genealogy, you first have to understand what a genealogy was for. In the ancient world, and especially in 1st century Jewish culture, a genealogy was not a piece of trivia. It was a legal document, a political argument, and a theological claim rolled into one. When you recited a man's genealogy, you were not telling people who his grandparents were. You were telling them who he was. You were establishing his right to land, to title, to priesthood, to prophecy. The tribe of Levi served in the temple, and if you could not prove your Levitical descent, you did not serve. The priests came from the line of Aaron, and if the records were lost, as they sometimes were after the exile, entire families were excluded from the priesthood until the genealogy could be reconstructed. The records mattered. They were the proof that the thread had not been broken, that the promises still held, that God had not forgotten the specifics. And the specifics for the Messiah were exacting. He had to be a son of Abraham, a member of the covenant people. He had to descend from the tribe of Judah, because Jacob's blessing had declared that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. He had to sit in the lineage of David, the shepherd king who had united the fractured tribes and made Jerusalem the city of God, because God had sworn an oath to David that his throne would be established forever. If you could not prove these things, your claim to messiahship was dead before you opened your mouth. The genealogy was not an afterthought. It was the argument. And the argument had rules so deeply embedded in the tradition that they did not need to be written down because everyone already knew them. Chief among these unwritten rules was one so obvious that stating it would have seemed absurd. Genealogies traced the male line, father to son, unbroken, undiluted, clean as a blade. Women, in the formal genealogical tradition, simply did not appear. They were not absent because they did not matter. Any culture that produced figures like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Miriam, and Deborah could hardly be accused of thinking women were irrelevant. They were absent because the system did not require them. The inheritance passed through the man. The covenant promises attached to the man. The tribal identity descended through the man. A woman might be remembered in a song, honored in a story, celebrated in the prayers of the community, but she did not appear in the formal record of descent. This makes what Matthew does so quietly extraordinary that it is possible to read right past it without realizing that the author has just detonated a small explosive device inside his own argument. 42 generations, dozens upon dozens of men begetting other men who beget other men. The chain rattling forward through centuries of kings and exiles and forgotten farmers. The rhythm is almost liturgical. The beat never changes. The pattern never varies. The eye begins to glaze, and the ear begins to drift, and the names start to blur into a single unbroken hum of fatherhood and sonship. And then, without announcement, without explanation, without the slightest signal that anything unusual is happening, Matthew slips a woman's name into the chain. Judah begat Perez and Zerah by Tamar. 3 words, by Tamar. A tiny phrase tucked into the relentless rhythm, easy to skip. But those 3 words are an earthquake, and Matthew is not finished. A few verses later, Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. Then Boaz begat Obed by Ruth. Then, in a phrasing so pointed it can only be deliberate, David begat Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. And finally, at the very end, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. 5 women. In 42 generations. 5 disruptions in a record that had no structural reason to include any of them. The question that has haunted every serious reader of this text for 2,000 years is deceptively simple. Why these 5? Why not Sarah, the mother of the nation? Why not Rebekah, who engineered the transfer of a blessing? Why not Rachel, the great romantic figure of the patriarchal age, whose death on the road to Bethlehem cast a shadow over generations? Why not Leah, who bore 6 of the 12 tribes? Why not Miriam, who led the women of Israel in song after the Red Sea? Why not Deborah, who commanded armies? Why not Hannah, whose prayer became the template for the Magnificat that Mary would one day sing? These were the safe names, the expected names, the names that would have made the list more beautiful without making it more dangerous. Matthew chose none of them. He reached past every matriarch, every prophetess, every judge and queen and mother of tribes, and he chose instead 5 women, whose stories are tangled in scandal, ambiguity, foreignness, and the kind of moral complexity that makes religious institutions deeply uncomfortable. Matthew does not explain why he included them. He offers no footnote, no apology, no theological justification. He simply puts their names in the list and keeps going, as if anyone tracing the bloodline of the Son of God would obviously mention these particular women with these particular histories. The silence is deliberate. Matthew was not a careless writer. His gospel is the most structured, the most architecturally precise of the 4. He arranges his genealogy into 3 neat sets of 14 generations, from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian exile, from the exile to Christ. The numerology is intentional. 14 is twice 7, the number of completeness, and in Hebrew, the consonants of David's name add up to 14. By structuring his genealogy around that number, Matthew is making the argument that all of history has been moving in measured beats toward the arrival of David's greater son. This is a man who counts syllables. He did not include those 5 names by accident. What connects them is not a single trait, but a single shape. Each of these women found herself in a situation where the normal categories broke down, where the rules as they existed could not account for what was happening. where the clean and respectable path would have led to a dead end, and the survival of the promise required something unexpected. In every case, the official story, the comfortable story, the story the institution would have preferred to tell, was not the story that actually happened. In every case, God's purposes moved through the mess, not around it. And in every case, the woman herself acted not as a passive vessel, but as a human being making choices under impossible pressure, trusting, or perhaps only hoping, that the outcome would justify the cost. Matthew was telling his readers, before they had even reached the first miracle, before the manger or the star or the wise men, that the God of Israel had always worked this way, that the line was never clean, that the ancestry of the Messiah was not a succession of saints marching in orderly procession from Abraham to Bethlehem, but a ragged, human, gloriously imperfect chain of people who stumbled into their roles and sometimes sinned their way into the story, and occasionally had no idea they were in the story at all. The genealogy is not a preface, it is the thesis, and the thesis only becomes visible when you stop skimming the names and start asking why each one is there, when you follow each name back into the story it came from and discover what that story contains. The genealogy lists them in order: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, Mary. And in that order, their stories form something like a staircase, each one building on the last, each one deepening the pattern, each one adding a new dimension to the argument Matthew is quietly making about who God is and how God works. They did not know how the story ended. They only knew what was in front of them: a road, a wall, a field, a rooftop, a room. And what they did in those moments, for reasons that were tangled and human and never entirely pure, turned out to be the hinge on which everything swung. Matthew put their names in the list. He did not explain them. The explanation is the rest of the story. And it begins, as the genealogy itself begins, with the tribe of Judah, and with a woman named Tamar, who sat by a road and waited for a man who owed her a future he had no intention of providing. Judah was the fourth son of Jacob, and he was not the best of them. He was not the firstborn. That was Reuben, who forfeited his position by sleeping with his father's concubine. He was not the favorite. That was Joseph, the dreamer in the coat of many colors, whose preferential treatment had turned his brothers into a pack of wolves. And he was not the quietest, or the most pious, or the most obedient. What Judah was, above all, was a pragmatist. When his brothers stood over a pit in the wilderness, staring down at the 17-year-old Joseph, debating whether to kill him or simply leave him to die, it was Judah who proposed a third option. Sell him. Sell the boy to the Ishmaelite traders passing through on their way to Egypt. What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? He said. And the question tells you everything you need to know about the man. He did not argue that murder was wrong. He argued that murder was wasteful. The brothers agreed. Joseph was hauled out of the pit and sold for 20 pieces of silver. And Judah went home with his share of the money, and a blood-stained coat that he and his brothers dipped in goat's blood and presented to their father as evidence that his favorite son had been killed by a wild animal. Jacob's grief was total. He tore his garments, put on sackcloth, and mourned for days that stretched into weeks, then months, then years. He refused to be comforted. His sons stood around him, offering words of consolation they did not mean, knowing what they had done, and the weight of it sat on all of them, but perhaps on Judah most of all, because Judah had been the one who turned fratricide into commerce, and commerce does not cleanse the conscience the way violence sometimes pretends to. A murderer can tell himself he acted in passion. A slave trader has to admit he did the arithmetic. It was after this, after the sale of Joseph, after the lie, after the shattering of his father, that Judah did something unusual. He left. Genesis records it with the kind of flat, understated language that conceals seismic shifts. It came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brothers. The phrase went down is geographic, meaning he traveled from the hill country to the lowlands, but it carries a moral undertone that the Hebrew reader would not miss. Judah descended. He separated himself from his family, from the tents of Jacob, from the community of the covenant, and he went to live among the Canaanites. He settled near a man named Hira, who became his friend, his companion in this new life, far from the obligations and the guilt he had left behind. And it was there, in the lowlands, among a people who worshipped gods his father would have cursed, that Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua, and he took her as his wife. The text does not give her a name. She is called only the daughter of Shua, or in some traditions, Bathsheba, which is not so much a name as a description. She is a shadow in the narrative, present only to produce children and then to die. But her presence matters, because by marrying a Canaanite woman, Judah was doing something that Abraham had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent. Abraham had sent his servant back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac from among his own people, specifically to avoid intermarriage with the Canaanites. Isaac and Rebekah had been grieved when Esau married Hittite women. The avoidance of Canaanite intermarriage was not a preference, it was a principle. And Judah, the man through whom the covenant line would pass, the man whose tribe would carry the scepter and the promise, walked straight into it without a second thought. He saw her. He took her. The Hebrew is blunt. There is no courtship described, no negotiation, no prayer for guidance. Judah wanted what he wanted, and he took it. She bore him 3 sons. The first was Er, the second was Onan, the third was Shelah. And when Er, the eldest, reached the age of marriage, Judah found him a wife. Her name was Tamar. The name means palm tree, and in the ancient Near East, the palm was a symbol of beauty, resilience, and fruitfulness. It grew where other trees could not, drawing water from deep beneath the surface of arid land, standing tall in places that should have been barren. Whether Tamar was Canaanite or from some other people group, the text does not say with certainty, though the context, Judah's own Canaanite marriage, his Canaanite neighbors, the Canaanite setting of the entire chapter makes it overwhelmingly likely that she was. What the text does say is that Judah chose her. He selected this woman to be the wife of his firstborn son, to carry on the family line, to bear the next generation. He placed her inside his household, gave her a role and a future, and then, almost immediately, the future began to collapse. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. The text does not elaborate. It does not tell us what did, what sin he committed, what specific act of wickedness brought about divine judgment. The silence is striking, because the Bible is rarely shy about cataloging sin. It will describe in detail the transgressions of kings, the failures of prophets, the crimes of entire cities. But wickedness is left blank, a void in the record, and the effect is to make his death feel sudden and absolute, like a door slamming shut. One verse he exists, the next he is gone. And Tamar, who had entered this family as a bride, who had expected children, a household, a future measured in sons and grandsons, was now a widow before she had become a mother. In the ancient world, a childless widow was not merely unfortunate. She was in danger. Without a husband, she had no provider. Without sons, she had no protector, no advocate, no one obligated by blood to ensure she was fed in her old age, sheltered from violence, given a place in the community. A childless widow could be sent back to her father's house, which was a kind of social demotion, a return to a status she had outgrown, a public declaration that her marriage had produced nothing. Or she could simply be forgotten, left to drift on the margins of a society that measured a woman's worth by the children she bore and the household she maintained. Tamar was staring into that abyss. And the law of Israel, or at least the custom that would later be codified as law, provided her with exactly one escape. The custom was called levirate marriage, from the Latin word levir, meaning husband's brother. Its logic was simple and, in the context of the ancient world, compassionate. When a man died without producing an heir, his brother was obligated to marry the widow and father a child in the dead man's name. The first son born of that union would not be considered the brother's child. He would be legally regarded as the son of the dead man, inheriting his property, carrying his name, ensuring that his line did not vanish from the earth. The custom protected the widow by giving her a new husband and a child. It protected the dead man by preserving his legacy. And it protected the family by keeping the property within the clan. It was, in its own way, an act of communal responsibility, a recognition that the family owed something to its dead and to the women who had been brought into its care. Judah understood the obligation. He gave Tamar to his second son, Onan, and told him to go in to her and raise up offspring for his dead brother. Onan obeyed, in part. He went in to Tamar. He lay with her. But he did not do what the custom required, because Onan understood something that Tamar was not in a position to control. If he fathered a child in Er's name, that child would inherit Er's share of Judah's estate, reducing Onan's own inheritance. The dead man's portion would go to the dead man's son, and Onan would have gained a nephew at the cost of his own wealth. And so, in one of the most coldly self-interested acts in the Old Testament, Onan would lie with Tamar but spill his seed on the ground before the act could be completed, ensuring that she would never conceive. He used her body for his own pleasure while deliberately denying her the child she was owed. He went through the motions of the obligation while gutting it of its meaning. He performed the act without performing the duty. The text says that what Onan did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death also. 2 sons dead, 2 husbands gone. Tamar was now twice a widow, and the pattern was beginning to look less like misfortune and more like a curse. This is exactly how Judah interpreted it. The text tells us that Judah was afraid to give Tamar his third son, Shelah, because he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. Notice the logic. Judah did not attribute his sons' deaths to their own wickedness, which is what the text explicitly states was the cause. He attributed their deaths to Tamar. In Judah's mind, the common factor was not his son's behavior. It was the woman they had married. She was the variable. She was the danger. Something about Tamar, some curse, some dark quality, some lethal femininity, was killing his boys. And so he made a calculation, the kind of cold, protective arithmetic that a father performs when he is more concerned with preserving his surviving child than with honoring his obligations to the woman he brought into his family. He told Tamar to go back to her father's house and wait there until Shelah grew up. "Remain a widow in your father's house until Shelah my son grows up," he said, and the words were a promise. They sounded like a delay, a temporary arrangement, a reasonable request to wait until the boy was old enough for marriage. But Tamar knew, or would soon come to know, that the promise was hollow. Judah had no intention of giving Shelah to her, but Tamar knew, or would soon come to know, that the promise was hollow. Judah had no intention of giving Shelah to her. He was buying time. hoping she would accept her exile quietly, hoping the problem would solve itself, hoping that if he simply waited long enough, the obligation would fade and nobody would notice. And so Tamar went. She returned to her father's house. She put on the garments of a widow, the clothing that announced to the world that she was in mourning, that she was between lives, that she was waiting. And she waited. The text does not tell us how long, but the implication is that it was years. Shelah grew up. He became a man, old enough for marriage, old enough to fulfill the obligation his father had promised. And Judah did not send for her. He did not summon her back. He did not give her his third son. He simply let the silence do its work, trusting that a woman who had been sent away, a woman who was sitting in her father's house in widow's clothes, a woman who had no power and no advocate, would eventually accept her fate and disappear from the story. Judah underestimated Tamar. Time passed. Judah's own wife, the unnamed daughter of Shua, died. He mourned her, and when the mourning was complete, he made plans to travel to Timnah for the sheep shearing, accompanied by his friend Hira the Adullamite. Sheep shearing was not a solemn occasion. It was a festival, a time of abundance and celebration, when the year's wool was collected and the profits were counted. It was a time when men drank and feasted and felt generous and invulnerable, the ancient equivalent of a business trip that ends at a banquet. News of Judah's journey reached Tamar, and when she heard that her father-in-law was going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, something shifted in her. What happened next was not impulsive. It was a plan, conceived in silence, executed with precision, and built on a knowledge of Judah's character that could only have come from years of watching, years of paying attention, years of sitting in her father's house with nothing to do but think about the man who had promised her a future and stolen it back. Tamar removed her widow's garments. She covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself so completely that her face could not be seen, and she went and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which was on the road to Timnah, the road Judah would take. The location was deliberate. Enaim, or Petach Enaim, means the opening of the eyes, a name so perfect for what was about to happen that it almost feels invented, though it was a real place, a crossroads on the route between Judah's territory and the sheep-shearing grounds. It was also, and this mattered, a place where women sometimes sat who were not waiting for their fathers-in-law. The veil Tamar wore, the location she chose, the posture she assumed, all of it communicated a single, unmistakable message to any man passing by. She was presenting herself as a prostitute. Some scholars have argued that she was presenting herself specifically as a cult prostitute, a Quedishah, a woman associated with the fertility rites of Canaanite religion, and the text lends some support to this, because when Judah later sent his friend Hira to find the woman and pay her, Hira asked the locals about the cult prostitute who was at Enaim, using the word Quedishah rather than the common word for a prostitute, Zonah. Whether the distinction matters to the moral calculation is debatable. What matters is that Tamar knew what she was doing, and she knew what Judah would do when he saw her. Judah came down the road. He saw the veiled woman sitting by the entrance to Enaim. He did not recognize her, because her face was covered. And without hesitation, without inquiry, without a moment of self-restraint, he approached her and said, "Come, let me come into you." The words are direct, transactional, and entirely unsentimental. Judah, recently widowed, on his way to a celebration, feeling the expansiveness that comes with freedom from obligation, saw what he took to be a roadside prostitute and propositioned her on the spot. He did not know her name. He did not ask. He did not care. But Tamar was not a woman acting without a plan. She was a woman who had been thinking about this moment for years, and she knew that the encounter itself was not enough. She needed proof. She needed evidence that would be irrefutable, that could not be denied or explained away, that would force Judah to confront what he had done, not just in this moment on the road, but in the years of broken promises that had brought them both to it. And so when Judah propositioned her, she did not simply agree, she negotiated. "What will you give me, that you may come into me?" she asked. Judah offered to send her a young goat from his flock, a generous payment worth more than the usual transaction would warrant. But Tamar pressed further. A promise of future payment was just that, a promise, and she had learned from bitter experience what Judah's promises were worth. She demanded a pledge, a deposit, something she could hold in her hands until the goat arrived. Judah asked what she wanted, and Tamar's answer was surgical in its precision. "Your signet, your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." The signet was a cylinder seal, or a ring, carved with a unique design that Judah used to stamp his identity onto documents and transactions. It was the ancient equivalent of a signature, a fingerprint, a piece of identification so personal that no two were alike. The cord was the string or chain from which the signet hung around his neck. And the staff was not merely a walking stick. It was a symbol of authority, of tribal leadership, often carved with identifying marks that announced its owner's family and status. Together, these three items were Judah's identity. They were the things that proved he was Judah, the son of Jacob, the head of his clan. To hand them over was to hand over himself, completely, unmistakably, undeniably. And Judah handed them over, without hesitation, without suspicion. He gave this veiled stranger his seal, his cord, and his staff, the very markers of his identity as patriarch, because he wanted what he wanted, and the cost, in that moment, did not seem particularly high. He went into her, she conceived by him, and then she rose, went away, removed her veil, and put back on the garments of her widowhood. She returned to her father's house, carrying inside her the child that Judah had refused to give her through the proper channels, and carrying in her hands the proof that the child was his. When Judah sent his friend Hira the Adullamite to deliver the goat and retrieve his pledge, Hira could not find the woman. He asked the men of Enaim about the cult prostitute who had been sitting by the road, and they told him there had been no cult prostitute there, no one matching the description, no woman at all. Hira returned to Judah empty-handed, and Judah, embarrassed but unwilling to make a public spectacle of himself, decided to let the matter drop. "Let her keep the things," he said, "lest we be laughed at." The calculation was familiar. Better to lose the signet and the staff than to be publicly mocked for having been outwitted by a roadside prostitute. Judah's concern was not justice. It was not morality. It was reputation. The same instinct that had led him to sell Joseph rather than kill him, the instinct that preferred a quiet sin to a noisy one, led him now to write off his own identity markers, rather than endure the humiliation of admitting what had happened. 3 months passed, and then word reached Judah that would change everything. His daughter-in-law Tamar, the woman he had sent away, the woman he had refused to give his son, the woman he had effectively abandoned to a lifetime of childless widowhood, was pregnant. And since she was still technically betrothed to Shelah, still bound to Judah's household, her pregnancy was not merely scandalous, it was a crime. She had committed fornication while under the authority of her father-in-law's house, and the penalty in Judah's jurisdiction was death. Judah's response was immediate, and it was terrifying in its swiftness. "Bring her out," he said, "and let her be burned." Not stoned, burned. The punishment Judah demanded was more severe than what the law would later prescribe for adultery, which was death by stoning. Burning was reserved for the most extreme cases, for violations so grievous that the normal penalties were deemed insufficient. That Judah reached for this punishment without hesitation, without investigation, without asking who the father was or what the circumstances were, tells you something about the rage that burned in him, and about the guilt. Because Judah was not simply punishing a sexual transgression. He was punishing the woman he had wronged, the woman whose very existence was a reminder of his broken promise, the woman whose pregnancy now made public the fact that Shelah had never been given to her. Every day that Tamar sat in her father's house, visibly unmarried, visibly childless, was an accusation against Judah. And now she was pregnant, which meant that someone else had given her what Judah had withheld. The child in her womb was an indictment, and Judah's instinct was to destroy the evidence. They brought her out. The execution was being prepared. The fire was being laid. And in that moment, with her life measured in minutes, Tamar played her hand. She sent a message to Judah, not a plea, not a confession, not a cry for mercy, a message calm and precise and devastating. By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she produced the signet, the cord, and the staff. The scene that followed is one of the most dramatic in the entire Hebrew Bible, not because of its violence, but because of its silence. Judah looked at the items. He recognized them. Of course he recognized them. They were his. His seal, his cord, his staff, his identity, handed over on a roadside to a veiled woman he had not bothered to identify, now held up before him in the hands of the daughter-in-law he had condemned to death. The evidence was absolute. There was no room for denial, no space for deflection, no angle from which the facts could be rearranged into a story that let him escape. He was the father. He was the one who had lain with her. He was the one who had failed to give her Shelah. He was the one who had broken the promise. He was the one who, moments earlier, had called for her to be burned alive for the pregnancy that he himself had caused. And Judah, to his credit, or to whatever fraction of credit a man earns when he finally tells the truth after a lifetime of evasion, did not deny it. He did not try to explain it away. He did not accuse Tamar of entrapment, though that is precisely what she had done. He did not claim the items were stolen or forged. He looked at the evidence. He looked at the woman who held it, and he said 5 words that echo across 3,000 years of moral philosophy. She is more righteous than I. Tzadka mimeni. The Hebrew is compact and explosive. She is right, and I am wrong. She is just, and I am unjust. She did what the situation demanded, and I failed to do what duty required. The word tzadka does not merely mean innocent or not guilty. It means righteous, a word that, in the biblical vocabulary, carries the weight of cosmic alignment, of being in right relationship with God and with the obligations that God's law imposes. Judah was saying that Tamar, the woman who disguised herself as a prostitute and seduced her own father-in-law, was more aligned with the purposes of God than he was. She had broken every rule of decorum, propriety, and sexual convention, and she was still, somehow, in the right, because she had done what she did not out of lust, not out of spite, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a determination to claim the future that was owed to her, the child that the Levirate custom guaranteed her, the continuation of the line that Judah had blocked. And Judah added one more phrase, one that the text records almost as an afterthought, but that completes the confession. Because I did not give her to Shelah, my son. He named his own failure. He identified the cause. He admitted, publicly, in front of whatever assembly had gathered to watch Tamar burn, that the chain of events that led to this moment began with him, with his fear, with his broken promise, with his willingness to sacrifice a woman's future to protect his remaining son. The fire that had been laid for Tamar was never lit. She was not burned. She was not punished. She was vindicated, not by her own words, but by the words of the man who had wronged her. Judah did not go in to her again. The text notes this quietly, as if to clarify that what happened on the road to Timnah was not the beginning of an affair, but the execution of a plan, a single, precise act aimed at a single, specific result. Tamar had gotten what she came for. She did not need or want Judah as a lover. She wanted the child, the heir, the future. And the future arrived in dramatic fashion. Tamar was carrying twins. When the time of her delivery came, the labor was complicated in a way that even the midwife found remarkable. One child put out his hand first, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it, saying, "This one came out first." But then the hand withdrew, and the other child came out ahead of him, pushing past, forcing his way into the world before his brother. The midwife exclaimed, "What a breach you have made for yourself!" and named him Perez, meaning breach or breaking through. The second child, the one with the scarlet thread still tied around his wrist, was born after and named Zerah, meaning brightness or rising. The birth was a reversal, and reversals are the currency of this story. The younger supplanting the elder, the unexpected child taking precedence over the expected one, the breach in the natural order that opens a new path forward. Jacob had supplanted Esau. Joseph would rise above his brothers. And now Perez, the child who was not supposed to come first, pushed his way to the front of the line. It is through Perez, not Zerah, that the genealogy of Matthew traces the messianic descent. The child born of scandal, the son of Judah and his daughter-in-law, the product of a roadside deception that broke every rule of propriety in the ancient world, became the ancestor through whom the line of David and the line of Christ would run. The scarlet thread tied around Zerah's wrist is a detail that seems almost too vivid to be incidental. Scarlet threads and scarlet cords will reappear in this story, in a different city, on a different wall, with a different woman whose life depends on what the thread signifies. But that is still to come. What remains, here at the end of Tamar's story, is the question of what to do with her. She is not easy to categorize. She is not a villain. Judah himself declared her righteous. She is not a victim, at least not a passive one. She engineered her own rescue with a cunning that borders on genius. She is not a saint. She disguised herself as a prostitute and slept with her father-in-law, and no amount of contextual explanation can make that a comfortable Sunday morning lesson. She is, perhaps most accurately, a woman who refused to disappear. Judah had tried to erase her from the story, to send her away, to let silence do its work, to let time and distance dissolve the obligation he owed her. And Tamar, sitting in her father's house in the garments of perpetual widowhood, watching the years go by, watching Shelah grow to manhood without any summons arriving, decided that she would not be erased. She would force the story to include her, even if the only way to do it was to sit by a road in a veil and wait for the man who owed her everything to come and pay with his own identity. She got her child. She got two, in fact. She got her place in the family of Judah. She got the line. And centuries later, when a man named Matthew sat down to trace the ancestry of the Messiah, he did not skip over her. He put her name first, before any of the others, as if to say, this is where the pattern starts. This is the first crack in the clean story. This is the first time a woman forced her way into the record by doing something that everyone would rather not discuss, but that nobody, not even the man who judged her, could call unjust. She is more righteous than I. Judah's words did not make Tamar respectable. They made respectability irrelevant. The question was never whether she followed the rules. The question was whether the line survived, whether the promise continued, whether the future that God had woven into the tribe of Judah would be carried forward or allowed to die in a widow's empty house. Tamar ensured that it was carried forward. She ensured it with deception, with sexuality, with a veil and a calculated risk, and 3 borrowed items that held a man's entire identity. And the God who could have written this ancestor out of the story, who could have found a cleaner path, a less embarrassing route from Abraham to David, kept her name in the book. The palm tree, it turns out, was well named. It grew where nothing else would. It drew life from a depth that the surface could not see, and it stood. But if Tamar's story is the story of a woman who forced her way into the covenant people from the position of a wronged insider, the next name in Matthew's genealogy belongs to a woman who had no claim to the covenant at all. She was not a daughter-in-law denied her rights. She was not an Israelite by marriage or by birth. She was a Canaanite, a citizen of a city that God had marked for total destruction, and she practiced the oldest profession in the world, in the shadow of walls that were about to fall. Her name was Rahab, and she lived in Jericho. And when 2 strangers knocked on her door, she made a decision that would change the course of 2 nations. Jericho sat in the Jordan Valley like a clenched fist, low and thick and ancient, surrounded by walls that had been standing for longer than anyone alive could remember. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the face of the earth, positioned at the mouth of the valley where the trade routes crossed, where the water from the springs made the land impossibly green against the pale desert that stretched behind it. To the east, across the Jordan River, a nation of former slaves were camped in the plains of Shittim, hundreds of thousands of them, with their tents and their livestock and their God who had, 40 years earlier, split an ocean in half to get them out of Egypt. Jericho had heard the stories. Every kingdom between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean had heard the stories. And now the slaves were no longer wandering. They were camped. They were waiting. And everyone in Jericho knew what they were waiting for. The city had prepared as best it could. The gates were shut, bolted from the inside, locked against what was coming. No one went out, and no one came in. The double walls of Jericho, which were the pride of the city and the source of its confidence, rose from the earth in 2 concentric rings, the outer wall 6 feet thick, the inner wall 12, with a gap between them that had been filled with packed earth, and sometimes with houses, small dwellings wedged into the space between the walls like teeth in a jaw. The fortification was formidable. It had repelled enemies before. But this enemy was different, because this enemy had a God who did things to water and to armies and to the firstborn sons of pharaohs, and the people of Jericho, for all their thick walls and barred gates, were terrified. It was into this city, sealed and trembling, that Joshua sent 2 spies. Joshua was not Moses. He did not have Moses' intimacy with God, or his eloquence, or his history of miracles performed in the courts of kings. What Joshua had was competence, the hard, practical, unsentimental competence of a military commander who understood that faith in God did not eliminate the need for intelligence. Moses had sent 12 spies into Canaan a generation earlier, and the mission had been a catastrophe. 10 of the 12 returned with reports so terrifying that the entire nation panicked and refused to enter the land, earning themselves 40 years of wandering in the desert as punishment for their cowardice. Joshua had been one of the 2 spies who came back with a good report, who said the land could be taken, who trusted that the God who had drowned Pharaoh's army could handle a few fortified cities. He remembered what fear had cost his people. This time, he sent only 2 men, and he sent them quietly, without fanfare, without announcement, without giving the larger camp an opportunity to panic. "Go, view the land," he told them, especially Jericho. The instruction was precise. Jericho was the gateway. If Jericho fell, the hill country beyond it lay open. If Jericho held, the invasion stalled before it began. The two spies crossed the Jordan. They entered the city, which means either the gates were not as tightly sealed as the narrative suggests, or there were still ways in and out for those who knew them, or God simply opened a path. The text does not explain how they got in. It only tells us where they went, to the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they lodged there. The choice of lodging has generated 2,000 years of commentary, most of it uncomfortable. Why would two Israelite spies on a mission from the commander of God's army go directly to a brothel? The explanations are various and occasionally amusing. Some ancient rabbis, embarrassed by the implication, argued that the Hebrew word zonah, used to describe Rahab, actually means innkeeper rather than prostitute, noting that the root can be related to the word for food or provisions. This interpretation is creative but unconvincing. The word zonah appears dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible, and in every other instance it means exactly what it appears to mean. Other commentators have argued that the spies went to Rahab's house precisely because it was a brothel, on the theory that a house accustomed to receiving strange men at odd hours would be the least likely place to attract suspicion. Two foreign men entering a private home in a city on lockdown would be noticed immediately. Two foreign men entering a house where men came and went at all hours would barely register. The logic is sound, if cynical, and it suggests that Joshua's spies were not naive about the world they were operating in. But there is a simpler and more important reason why the narrative places the spies in Rahab's house, and it has nothing to do with operational security. It has to do with the kind of story the book of Joshua is telling. Because the story of Rahab is, at its core, a story about seeing clearly in a world that has gone blind with fear, and it is precisely the person you would least expect, a Canaanite prostitute in a condemned city, who turns out to have the clearest vision of all. Rahab's house was built into the city wall itself. The text tells us this later, when she lowers the spies from her window and they descend the outer face of the fortification. She lived in the gap between the walls, in one of those small dwellings that occupied the space where the inner and outer defenses met. This was not a prestigious address. The people who lived in the walls were, by definition, the people who could not afford to live anywhere else: the poor, the marginal, the socially disreputable. For a prostitute, it was a practical location. Her clients could come and go without passing through the center of town, and the proximity to the wall meant she was close to the gates, where travelers entered and trade was conducted. But it also meant that Rahab lived, quite literally, on the edge. She inhabited the boundary between inside and outside, between the city and the wilderness, between safety and exposure. When the walls came down, her house would be the first to fall. And when salvation came, she would have to lean out of her own window to reach it. The spies arrived. They lodged in her house. And almost immediately, their cover was blown. Someone reported their presence to the king of Jericho, who sent soldiers to Rahab's door with a command that was as direct as a fist. "Bring out the men who came to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." The knock on the door was the fulcrum of Rahab's life, the moment on which everything before and everything after would pivot. She had two options, and both of them were terrible. She could hand over the spies, which would earn her the gratitude of her king and the safety of a loyal citizen, but would also mean siding with a city she already knew was doomed. Or she could hide them. which would make her a traitor to her own people, a collaborator with the enemy, a woman who had chosen foreign invaders over the community that had sustained her, however marginally, for her entire life. There was no middle ground, no neutral position, no way to hedge the bet. She had to choose, and she had to choose now, with the king's soldiers standing at her door. Rahab chose the spies. She had already hidden them. Before the soldiers arrived, before the knock came, she had taken the two men up to her roof and concealed them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out there to dry. Flax was used to make linen, and the fact that Rahab had large quantities of it on her roof suggests that she supplemented her income with textile work, a common occupation for women in the ancient Near East, and one that gave her access to materials, trade contacts, and a degree of economic independence that her primary profession might not have provided on its own. The flax lay in thick bundles on the flat roof, enough to cover two grown men if they lay still and kept quiet, and Rahab arranged it over them with the practiced calm of a woman who understood the mechanics of concealment. When the soldiers demanded that she produce the men, Rahab lied. She lied smoothly, efficiently, and without hesitation, constructing a story that was plausible enough to survive the moment and vague enough to send the soldiers in the wrong direction. "True, the men came to me," she said, "but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be shut at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." The lie was a masterpiece of misdirection. She admitted that the men had come to her house, which anyone in the neighborhood might have seen and could therefore confirm. She claimed ignorance of their origins, which was plausible for a woman whose business involved receiving strangers. And she sent the soldiers chasing after a phantom out through the gate toward the fords of the Jordan, in the opposite direction from where the spies actually were. The soldiers took the bait. They left. The gate was shut behind them, and Rahab climbed up to the roof. What she said to the two spies on that rooftop is one of the most remarkable speeches in the Old Testament, and it is remarkable precisely because of who is saying it. Rahab was a Canaanite. She worshipped Canaanite gods, or had been raised among those who did. She had no access to the Torah, no education in the traditions of Israel, no prophetic heritage, no covenant relationship with the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. She was, by every metric that Israel used to define religious identity, an outsider, a pagan, a daughter of the nations that Israel had been commanded to dispossess. And yet the words she spoke on that rooftop would constitute one of the most complete and theologically sophisticated confessions of faith anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. "I know that the Lord has given you the land," she said, "and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." Every phrase is loaded. "I know that the Lord has given you the land." Not, "I suspect," not, "I have heard a rumor." She used the language of certainty, of settled conviction, as if the outcome of the coming invasion were already history, and she were merely reporting on something that had already happened. "The fear of you has fallen upon us." She acknowledged what her king and her fellow citizens were desperately trying to deny, that the terror they felt was not a passing anxiety, but a divine judgment, a weight laid upon them by the same God who had parted the sea. "We have heard." The stories had reached Jericho, the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the destruction of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, kingdoms east of the Jordan that had opposed Israel and been annihilated. The intelligence was thorough. Rahab knew the military history. She knew the trajectory. And she drew the conclusion that every other citizen of Jericho had the information to draw, but lacked the courage to follow. The Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. That final phrase is staggering. It is a monotheistic declaration made by a polytheist in a polytheistic city on the eve of that city's destruction. Rahab was not saying that Israel's God was powerful. She was not saying he was merely one God among many who happened to be winning at the moment. She was saying he was God, the only one who mattered, sovereign over heaven and earth. Coming from a prophet or a priest of Israel, the statement would be unremarkable. Coming from a Canaanite prostitute, it is an earthquake. Because if Rahab was right, then everything her culture had built, every temple, every ritual, every prayer offered to Baal or Asherah or any of the other gods of the Canaanite pantheon was wrong. She was not merely switching sides in a military conflict. She was abandoning her entire cosmology. She was declaring, on a rooftop, in the dark, with soldiers hunting in the wrong direction and 2 frightened spies hiding under her flax, that she had seen something true, and that the truth required her to betray everything she had known. And then she negotiated. This is the part that reveals Rahab as something more than a frightened woman making a desperate gamble. She had saved the spies. She had risked her life. She had committed treason. And now, with the leverage that her actions had given her, she bargained. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. The language was precise. She did not ask for her own life alone. She asked for her entire family, her father, her mother, her brothers, her sisters, everyone connected to her household. She was thinking generationally, protectively, with the instinct of someone who understood that survival in isolation was no survival at all. And she asked for a sure sign, a tangible, visible mark that would distinguish her household from the rest of the city when the destruction came. She had seen in the stories she had heard about the God of Israel a pattern, that this God marked those he intended to save. The blood on the doorposts in Egypt, the night when the firstborn died, and only those behind the marked doors were spared. Rahab did not reference the Passover explicitly, but the parallel is unmistakable. She wanted a mark. She wanted to be identified. She wanted to be passed over. The spies agreed. They swore an oath, binding their lives to hers, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. The covenant was sealed. A Canaanite prostitute and 2 Israelite spies, on a rooftop in a doomed city, swore an oath to each other in the name of a God that one party had worshipped since birth and the other had only just discovered. The asymmetry is breathtaking. Rahab had everything to lose. The spies, if they kept their word, had only a single household to spare in a city they were going to annihilate. But oaths in the ancient world were not optional agreements that could be revised when circumstances changed. They were binding, permanent, enforced by the God in whose name they were sworn. The spies gave their word. And their word, it turned out, was good. Rahab lowered them from her window with a rope. The window faced outward, away from the city, because her house was built into the wall itself, and the outer face of the wall was the outer face of her home. The spies descended into the night, sliding down the stone, dropping into the darkness beyond the fortification. Before they went, they gave her the sign she had asked for. They told her to tie a cord of scarlet thread in the window through which she had let them down, and to gather her entire family into her house when the invasion came. Everyone inside the house, behind the scarlet cord, would be saved. Everyone outside would perish. The conditions were absolute. The cord had to be visible. The family had to be inside. If anyone left the house, their blood would be on their own head. The scarlet cord, a thread of red tied in a window, hanging against stone, visible from the outside to anyone who knew what to look for. The echo of the scarlet thread that the midwife tied around the wrist of Zerah, the son of Tamar and Judah, is too resonant to ignore. Red thread, marking the one who was supposed to come first but did not, and now red cord, marking the house that was supposed to be destroyed but would not be. The color of blood. The color of life spilling out or being preserved, depending on which side of the mark you stood. In the Passover, it was lamb's blood smeared on wooden door frames. In Jericho, it was a scarlet cord hanging from a stone window. The theology is the same. The mark saves, the sign preserves, the thread holds. Rahab tied the cord. She gathered her family, and she waited. The spies made their way back to Joshua, crossing the Jordan and reporting what they had found. Their intelligence assessment was brief and confident. Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. The assessment was built almost entirely on what Rahab had told them. The information they brought back was not gathered by skulking through the streets of Jericho, counting soldiers and measuring walls. It came from a conversation on a rooftop with a woman who had given them the single most important piece of intelligence a spy can obtain. The enemy's morale was broken. The walls were thick, but the hearts behind them were thin. Jericho was already defeated. It simply did not know it yet. What followed was one of the strangest military operations in recorded history. Joshua assembled the army of Israel on the banks of the Jordan and prepared to cross. The Jordan was in flood stage, swollen with the spring rains, impassable by normal means. But the God who had parted the Red Sea for Moses now parted the Jordan for Joshua, stopping the flow of the river so that the entire nation crossed on dry ground. The parallels were deliberate. Joshua was being established, in the eyes of the people, as Moses' legitimate successor, the man who carried the same authority and served the same God. When the people of Jericho saw the river stop, whatever remained of their courage must have evaporated. The stories they had heard about the Red Sea were no longer stories. They were watching it happen again, in their own valley, in their own river, within sight of their own walls. The army crossed. They made camp at Gilgal, east of Jericho. And then Joshua received instructions from God that must have bewildered every military mind in the camp. They were not going to besiege Jericho. They were not going to tunnel under the walls or scale them with ladders or batter them with rams. They were going to march around them. Once a day, for 6 days, the armed men of Israel would circle the city in silence, led by 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets made of ram's horns, with the Ark of the Covenant following behind them. No war cries, no weapons raised, no engagement with the enemy. Just a silent, deliberate, agonizingly slow procession around the perimeter of the city and then back to camp. For the people of Jericho, watching from the top of their walls, the sight must have been as psychologically devastating as any direct assault. An army that attacks can be fought. An army that marches in silence cannot be understood. The procession had the quality of a ritual, a ceremony, a funeral march for a city that was still alive. Each day the circuit was completed, and each day the army returned to camp, and each day the people of Jericho waited for the blow that did not fall, and the waiting was worse than the blow would have been. because it left the imagination free to construct terrors far greater than any reality could deliver. On the seventh day, the instructions changed. The army was to march around the city not once but 7 times. And at the end of the 7th circuit, when the priests blew a long blast on the trumpets, the people were to shout, just shout. Raise their voices in a single, unified, deafening cry, and the walls of the city would fall. They marched 7 times around, in silence, the dust rising under their feet, the trumpets sounding, but no human voice breaking the air. Inside the walls, Rahab waited with her family in her house, the scarlet cord hanging from her window, the only color against the stone. She had bet everything on the word of 2 men she had met once, on a rooftop in the dark. She had bet on a God she had never seen and had only recently learned to name. Every step the army took around the city was a step closer to the moment when she would discover whether her bet was good. The 7th circuit ended. The trumpets blew, the people shouted, and the walls of Jericho collapsed. The text does not describe the mechanism. It does not offer an engineering explanation or a seismological analysis. It says the walls fell down flat, using a Hebrew phrase that suggests they fell outward, crumbling away from the city rather than inward, as if an invisible hand had pushed them from inside. The fortifications that had stood for generations, the double walls with their packed earth and their houses and their watchmen, came down in a single catastrophic moment, and the army of Israel charged straight ahead, each man climbing over the rubble where the wall had been, entering a city that had no defenses left. What followed was total destruction. The text is explicit and unsparing. Every living thing in Jericho was devoted to destruction. Men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, donkeys, everything that breathed. The Hebrew word is cherem, a term that means something set apart, consecrated to God through destruction, removed from human use entirely. Jericho was not conquered in the conventional sense. It was not occupied or repopulated or absorbed into Israel's territory. It was annihilated, offered up as a kind of first fruits of the conquest, the first city of Canaan given entirely to God. The gold and silver and vessels of bronze and iron were placed in the treasury of the Lord. Everything else was destroyed. The city was burned with fire until nothing remained but ash and the memory of walls. But Joshua had remembered the oath. Before the assault began, he issued a specific command to the army. The city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. The order was unambiguous. In a city given over entirely to Cherem, to total sacred destruction, one house was exempt. One family was untouchable. One scarlet cord hanging from one window in one section of the wall was the difference between annihilation and survival. The 2 spies who had been hidden on Rahab's roof were sent to retrieve her. They went into the ruined city, found her house, and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. Every person she had gathered under her roof was saved. Every person she had bargained for on that rooftop was delivered. They were brought outside the camp of Israel, placed in a kind of holding area, a transitional space between the world they had left and the world they were entering, the social and spiritual equivalent of standing on a threshold. The text then adds a quiet, devastating line. But they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Everything except the family of a prostitute who had tied a red cord in her window. The asymmetry of the scene is almost unbearable. An entire city, with all its inhabitants, its history, its children, its temples, its markets, its generations of accumulated life, reduced to ashes. And one woman, one household, one family unit, walking out of the smoke because a Canaanite prostitute had seen something that the king of Jericho and all his advisers and all his soldiers and all his priests had failed to see, that the God of Israel was real, and that the only rational response to that reality was to switch sides immediately and completely, regardless of what it cost. Rahab and her family were settled outside the camp of Israel, and then, over time, they were absorbed into the community. The book of Joshua says, with the simplicity that marks the most extraordinary transitions, she has lived in Israel to this day. The prostitute became a neighbor. The Canaanite became an Israelite. The woman from the doomed city took up residence among the people of the covenant, and the record gives no indication that she was treated as a second-class citizen or a probationary member of the community. She lived in Israel. She stayed. She belonged. And then the story, which could have ended there, with a converted prostitute living quietly among her adopted people, goes further. Rahab married. The man she married was an Israelite named Salmon, and while the book of Joshua does not record this marriage, the genealogy in Matthew does, and so does the genealogy in the book of Ruth. Salmon was, by most reconstructions, a man of some standing in the tribe of Judah, possibly connected to the leadership of the community, possibly even one of the two spies whom Rahab had hidden, though the text does not confirm this, and the speculation remains just that, speculation. What is confirmed is the child they produced together. Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, the woman who lied to soldiers and hid spies and hung a scarlet cord from her window, bore a son named Boaz. Boaz. The name would mean nothing to a casual reader encountering it for the first time. But within the larger story that Matthew is constructing, within the genealogy that runs from Abraham to Jesus, the name Boaz is a hinge, because Boaz is the man who will appear in the next chapter of this narrative, in a barley field outside Bethlehem, extending his hand to another foreign woman, another outsider, another person who had no claim to the covenant and yet found herself drawn into it by a combination of courage, loyalty, and the kind of providence that looks from a distance like coincidence but is not. The son of a Canaanite prostitute would become the redeemer of a Moabite widow. The pattern is almost too neat, and yet it is there, woven into the genealogy like the scarlet thread woven into Rahab's window, visible only to those who stop long enough to look. What is most striking about Rahab, standing back from the details of her story and considering the shape of it whole, is the nature of her faith. She did not come to the God of Israel through study or instruction or the slow accumulation of spiritual insight. She came through information and inference. She heard the stories. She evaluated the evidence. She drew a conclusion. And then she acted on that conclusion with a decisiveness that makes most theological conversions look tentative by comparison. She did not wait for certainty. She did not ask for a sign. She did not require a visitation from an angel or a voice from a burning bush or a dream in the night. She heard what God had done. She believed it, and she staked her life and the lives of everyone she loved on the strength of that belief. The writer of the book of Hebrews many centuries later would include her in the great catalogue of faith, alongside Abraham and Moses and the prophets. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. The word disobedient is pointed. The rest of Jericho had the same information Rahab had. They had heard the same stories. They had seen the same evidence. They chose to bolt their gates and hope for the best. Rahab chose differently. She is also, and this is worth pausing on, the only person in the book of Joshua who is recorded as making a theological statement about the God of Israel. Joshua himself, the leader of the invasion, does not make a speech as clear and comprehensive as Rahab's rooftop confession. The priests who carry the ark do not articulate the faith as precisely as this Canaanite woman did. The soldiers who shout and bring down the walls do not express their understanding of who they are fighting for, with the clarity that Rahab brought to a conversation with two strangers she was hiding under bundles of flax. The finest confession of faith in the conquest narrative belongs to the prostitute. The deepest theology in the book of Joshua comes from the enemy. The pattern, if you are paying attention, is becoming familiar. God's purposes in this story have a persistent habit of moving through people who have no business being part of the plan. Rahab was a liar. She lied to the soldiers at her door, and the lie saved 2 lives, and through them, the intelligence operation that enabled the conquest. Rahab was a traitor. She betrayed her city, her king, and her people, and her betrayal preserved her family while everything else was destroyed. Rahab was a prostitute, and no amount of etymological gymnastics with the word zona will change that. She sold her body in a house built into the wall of a city that worshipped gods of fertility and storm, and she was, by every standard of respectability that either her own culture or Israel's culture would have applied, a woman of the lowest social standing, and she is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. She is there by name, in the first chapter of the first gospel, placed between Tamar the deceiver and Ruth the Moabite, as if Matthew wanted to make sure his readers understood that the pattern he was establishing was not a one-time anomaly, but a recurring theme. God moves through the unlikely, the disreputable, the foreign, the compromised. The line does not run clean. It never did. Rahab tied a scarlet cord in her window and waited for walls to fall. The walls fell. The cord held. And from the ruins of Jericho, a family walked out into a new world, carrying with them a son who would grow up to own fields near Bethlehem, fields where barley grew thick in the spring, fields where a foreign woman would one day bend low to gather the grain that had fallen from the reaper's hands. That woman's name was Ruth, and she had walked a very long road to reach those fields, a road that began with a famine and a funeral and a choice made on a dusty highway between 2 countries, when an old woman told her to go home and she refused. In the days when the judges ruled, which is the Bible's way of saying in the days when nobody was really in charge, when the tribes of Israel had no king and every man did what was right in his own eyes and the result was predictable chaos, a famine came to the land. Famine in the ancient world was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. The rains did not come, or came at the wrong time, or came and then stopped. The barley withered in the fields. The wheat failed. The cisterns ran low and the livestock grew thin, and the children began to show their ribs, and the calculation that every family had to make was not whether to act, but how long to wait before acting. You could stay and hope the rains would return. You could stay and watch your family starve. Or you could leave. A man named Elimelech chose to leave. He lived in Bethlehem, a small town in the hill country of Judah whose name, in one of those ironies that the Bible seems to collect the way other books collect adjectives, means house of bread. The house of bread had no bread. And so Elimelech took his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and he went east, across the Jordan, into the country of Moab, where the rains had been kinder and the fields still produced grain. The decision was practical, and it may have been necessary, but it carried a weight that the text does not need to explain, because every Israelite reader would have felt it immediately. Moab was not merely a foreign country, it was the wrong foreign country. The Moabites traced their origin to an act of incest, recorded in the book of Genesis, when Lot's elder daughter, believing that she and her father were the last humans alive after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, got him drunk and lay with him to preserve the family line. The child born of that union was named Moab, and his descendants became a nation that settled east of the Dead Sea, a nation that was, from its very conception, associated in the Israelite mind with moral transgression and the desperate measures people take when they believe the normal order has collapsed. The book of Deuteronomy codified the suspicion into law. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. The prohibition was not temporary. It was not conditional. It was permanent, generational, and absolute. To go to Moab was to go to a place that the law of Israel had declared permanently outside the covenant. Elimelech went anyway. Hunger makes theologians of no one. The family settled in Moab. The text says they went to sojourn there, using a word that implies a temporary stay, a stopover, a plan to return when conditions improved. But sojourns have a way of becoming permanent. The famine in Bethlehem did not lift quickly. The fields of Moab were fertile. The boys were growing. And then Elimelech died. The text offers no cause of death, no illness, no accident, no divine explanation. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. The sentence is flat, clinical, and brutal in its brevity. One verse, he is the head of the household, the decision-maker, the man who chose exile over starvation. The next verse, he is gone, and Naomi is a widow in a foreign land with 2 boys to raise and no apparent plan for getting home. The boys grew up. They married Moabite women. Their names were Orpah and Ruth. And here the story begins to coil around itself, because by marrying Moabite women, Mahlon and Chilion were doing exactly what the law of Israel warned against, intermarrying with a people from whom Israel was supposed to remain permanently separated. Elimelech had brought his family to Moab to save their bodies. In doing so, he may have endangered their identity. The sons did not marry Israelite women. They married locals. They put down roots. The sojourn was becoming a settlement, and the settlement was beginning to look like assimilation. 10 years passed, and then, in a single verse that moves with the terrible efficiency of a scythe, both sons died. Mahlon and Chilion also died, both of them, and the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. 3 funerals in 10 years, 3 men gone. The entire male line of Elimelech's household erased. Naomi, who had come to Moab as a wife and a mother, was now neither. She was a widow without sons, which in the ancient world was not merely a personal tragedy, but a social catastrophe. Without a husband, she had no provider. Without sons, she had no future, no security, no one obligated by blood to care for her in her old age. She was adrift, stranded in a country that was not her own, with 2 daughters-in-law who were lovely and loyal but who could not give her what she needed, which was a male heir, a continuation of the line, a reason for the community to regard her as something other than a burden. Word reached Naomi that the famine in Bethlehem had ended. The Lord had visited his people and given them food. The phrasing is theological. It was not merely that the rains had returned, but that God had turned his attention back to the land and restored its fertility. Naomi decided to go home. Whatever Moab had given her, it had also taken everything. She had buried her husband and her sons in foreign soil, and the only thing left for her was the road back to Bethlehem, where at least she would be among her own people, where the language was her language and the customs were her customs, and the God who had, in her view, treated her so cruelly was at least the God she knew. She set out. Orpah and Ruth set out with her. And on the road, somewhere between Moab and Judah, between the country of exile and the country of origin, Naomi stopped walking and turned to face the 2 young women who were following her. What she said to them was not a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with the authority of a woman who had nothing left to lose and who therefore had no reason to soften the truth. Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband." She kissed them, and they wept. The logic of Naomi's command was brutal but sound. She was going back to Bethlehem. She was old, or old enough. She had no more sons for them to marry, and even if she were to marry again tonight and conceive sons, would Ruth and Orpah wait the years it would take for those sons to grow to manhood? The question was rhetorical, and the answer was obvious: no. Naomi had nothing to offer these women. No husbands, no household, no future. She was returning to Israel as a destitute widow, and taking 2 Moabite daughters-in-law with her would not improve her situation. It would complicate it. Moabite women in Bethlehem would be foreigners, outsiders, women from the wrong side of the covenant line. They would face suspicion, hostility, and the weight of a legal tradition that said they did not belong. Naomi was trying to be kind. She was trying to set them free. She was telling them to go home, to find new husbands among their own people, to rebuild their lives in a place where they had a chance of being happy. It was the most loving thing she could do, and it was, she believed, the most realistic. Orpah and Ruth both protested. They wept and said, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi pressed harder. "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, 'I have hope,' even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." That last phrase is the key to understanding Naomi at this moment in the story. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She was not merely sad. She was not merely grieving. She believed that God was actively punishing her, that the deaths of her husband and sons were not random misfortunes, but targeted acts of divine judgment, and that anyone who stayed close to her would be caught in the blast radius. She was a woman who had concluded that she was cursed, and she was trying to get the people she loved out of the way before the curse struck again. Orpah was convinced. She wept, she kissed Naomi, and she turned back. She returned to Moab, to her people, to her gods. The text does not condemn her. It does not call her faithless or cowardly or weak. It simply records that she did what Naomi asked her to do, which was the reasonable thing, the sensible thing, the thing that any young widow without children would have been expected to do. Orpah went home. She disappears from the narrative. She is never mentioned again. Ruth did not go. Naomi turned to her remaining daughter-in-law and pointed to Orpah's retreating figure. "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." The instruction was reinforced by example. Orpah had done the right thing. Orpah had listened. Orpah had been sensible. Now, Ruth should follow suit. Go home. Find a Moabite husband. Worship Moabite gods. Live a Moabite life. Forget this miserable interlude with an Israelite family that brought you nothing but dead husbands and an old woman's bitterness. And Ruth, standing on that road, with Moab behind her and an uncertain future ahead, with every practical argument in the world telling her to turn around, spoke the words that have echoed through 3,000 years of literature, theology, and wedding ceremonies. Words so beautiful that their familiarity has almost robbed them of their original force. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." The speech is not a declaration of romantic love. though it has been borrowed for that purpose so often that most people encounter it first at weddings. It is a declaration of covenantal loyalty, spoken by a Moabite woman to her Israelite mother-in-law, and its terms are total. Ruth was not saying she would visit Bethlehem. She was not saying she would try Israel for a while and see how it went. She was renouncing everything. Her country, where you go, I will go. Her home, where you lodge, I will lodge. Her people, your people, shall be my people. Her religion, your God, my God. Her burial place, which in the ancient world was one of the most sacred markers of identity, the ground where your bones would rest with the bones of your ancestors. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And she sealed it with an oath, invoking the very God she was adopting, the God of Israel, a God she had only known through the broken life of a bitter old woman whose family had been destroyed. This is faith of a different kind than Rahab's. Rahab saw evidence of God's power and made a calculated decision to switch sides. Ruth saw evidence of God's apparent cruelty, saw a woman who believed that God's hand had gone out against her, saw a family reduced from 5 to 2, and chose that God anyway. Ruth did not choose the God of Israel because the evidence was compelling. She chose him because Naomi was going back to him, and Ruth would not let Naomi go alone. Her faith, if it can be called that at this stage, was expressed not as a theological proposition, but as a refusal to abandon a person. She attached herself to God by attaching herself to Naomi, and in doing so she performed an act of loyalty so absolute that it left Naomi, for the first time in the narrative, speechless. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. They walked to Bethlehem. 2 women, one old and one young, one Israelite and one Moabite, arriving at the gate of a small town at the beginning of the barley harvest. The whole town was stirred at their arrival, and the women of Bethlehem came out and said, "Is this Naomi?" The question carried surprise, recognition, and perhaps a hint of shock. Naomi had left Bethlehem as a married woman with 2 sons, a woman of standing, a woman whose name meant pleasant. She was returning as a widow without children, lean and weathered from the road, accompanied by a foreign girl whom no one recognized. Naomi's response was savage in its honesty. "Do not call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Mara, bitter." She renamed herself after the taste in her mouth. She told the women of Bethlehem that she had left full and returned empty. And the word empty in Hebrew carries the connotation of being poured out, drained, hollowed. She was accusing God, openly, publicly, at the gate of the town, in front of the neighbors. She did not whisper her complaint in private prayer. She announced it. The Almighty had testified against her. The Almighty had brought calamity. She did not soften the accusation or dress it in pious language. She named God as the agent of her suffering, and she invited the entire town to witness the damage. And standing beside her, unmentioned in Naomi's speech, invisible in Naomi's accounting, was Ruth. Naomi said she had returned empty. She was standing next to the woman who had given up everything to come with her. The irony is not subtle, and the narrator does not call attention to it, trusting the reader to feel the weight of what Naomi cannot see, that the provision she is looking for is already standing at her side, wearing Moabite clothes and speaking with a foreign accent. They had arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest, which was not a coincidence, but a structural signal. The harvest meant work was available. Grain was being cut, gathered, and processed. And among the customs of Israel was one that would become the mechanism of Ruth's survival. and the engine of the rest of the story, the right of gleaning. The law of Moses, recorded in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, required landowners not to harvest the corners of their fields or go back for sheaves they had missed. The edges and the leftovers were to be left for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. It was a system of institutionalized charity, built into the agricultural calendar, designed to ensure that those at the bottom of the social order could feed themselves without begging. A gleaner would follow behind the reapers, picking up the stalks of grain that had been dropped or missed, gathering enough to eat for the day, or, if she was fortunate and the landowner was generous, enough to store. Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field, and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." The request was modest, even timid. She was asking permission to do the lowest form of agricultural labor, the work reserved for the destitute, and she was acknowledging that even this depended on finding a landowner who would tolerate her presence. She was a Moabite. The law gave gleaning rights to foreigners, but the law and the attitude of the man who owned the field were not always the same thing. Ruth was stepping into a space where she had a legal right to be, but no social guarantee of welcome. Naomi's response was 2 words: "Go, my daughter." No encouragement, no blessing, no advice about which fields to try or which landowners might be sympathetic. Just permission given flatly from a woman who had run out of plans. Ruth went. And the text says, with a phrase so carefully chosen that it deserves to be read twice, she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. She happened to come. The Hebrew conveys something like, her chance chanced upon, a construction so deliberately awkward that it almost winks at the reader. The narrator is saying, with the straightest possible face, that Ruth's arrival in the field of Boaz was a coincidence, pure accident, random chance. She could have ended up in any field belonging to any landowner in Bethlehem, and she just happened, by sheer luck, to wander into the field of a man who was a relative of her dead father-in-law, a man of wealth and standing in the community, a man who had the legal standing to act as a kinsman redeemer for Elimelech's family. The narrator wants you to know that this was chance. The narrator also wants you to know that it was nothing of the kind. Boaz arrived at his field that day, coming from Bethlehem to check on the harvest. He was a man of substance, the text says, using a Hebrew word that implies wealth, influence, and a kind of moral gravity. He greeted his reapers with a blessing. "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." The exchange is small, but telling. This is a man whose relationship with his workers is characterized by mutual respect and shared faith. He is not a tyrant extracting labor from the desperate. He is a landowner who sees his field as a place where God's provision flows downward, from owner to worker to gleaner. And then Boaz noticed Ruth. She was in the field, bent low, gathering the stalks that had fallen from the reaper's hands. She was conspicuous, not only because she was young and presumably striking in appearance, but because she was unfamiliar. Bethlehem was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. A new face in the field would have been immediately noticed, and Boaz noticed her. He asked his foreman, "Whose young woman is this?" The question was not about ownership, but about identification. Whose household does she belong to? Whose family is she connected to? The foreman answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. The foreman's report is revealing. Ruth had asked permission before entering the field, which was not strictly necessary under the gleaning laws, but showed a deference that would have been noted. She had been working since early morning, which meant she was not lazy. and she had taken only a short rest, which meant she was not there to socialize or to find a husband or to make herself seen. She was there to work. She was there because she was hungry, and because Naomi was hungry, and because the barley in this field was the only thing standing between them and destitution. Boaz approached Ruth directly, and what he said to her was extraordinary in its generosity and its specificity. "Now, listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Every phrase was a gift. "Do not go to another field" meant she had a permanent place here, not just for today, but for the duration of the harvest. "Keep close to my young women" meant she was being placed under the protection of his female workers, a social shield against harassment. "I have charged the young men not to touch you" acknowledged a danger that Ruth, as a foreign woman gleaning alone, would have been acutely aware of, that unattached women in the fields were vulnerable to assault, and that a Moabite woman with no family to avenge her was more vulnerable than most. Boaz had already acted on her behalf before she knew it, issuing orders to his workers to leave her alone. And "drink what the young men have drawn" meant she was being given access to the household's water supply, a privilege that put her on the same footing as the hired workers, not below them. Ruth fell on her face. She bowed to the ground, and she asked the question that any person in her position would ask, the question that cuts through every layer of social convention and gets to the raw nerve of human experience. "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" The word she used was nokria, which means not merely a stranger, but a foreign woman, an outsider, someone who does not belong, someone who has no claim on the community's generosity or protection. She was naming her own status. She was saying, in effect, "I know what I am. I know where I come from. I know the law that says, 'My people are excluded from your assembly forever.' Why are you being kind to me?" Boaz's answer was a revelation, because it showed that Rahab's son had been paying attention, that the story of Ruth had already preceded her, that the small town of Bethlehem had been talking about the Moabite girl who had walked back from exile with old Naomi. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me," he said, "and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." The image of wings is central. In the Hebrew, the word is kanaf, which means wing, or edge, or corner. To come under the wings of the God of Israel was to seek shelter, the way a chick shelters under the wings of its mother, the way a person wraps a cloak around someone to indicate protection and belonging. Boaz was saying that Ruth, by choosing to follow Naomi and Naomi's God, had placed herself under divine protection, and he was praying that the God whose shelter she had sought would repay her with the full measure of his generosity. The prayer was sincere. Boaz did not yet know that he himself would be the instrument through which that prayer was answered. Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's field for the remainder of the barley harvest and into the wheat harvest. Boaz instructed his reapers to pull out stalks from their bundles deliberately and leave them on the ground for her, ensuring that she gathered far more than a typical gleaner would. Each evening she returned to Naomi with an abundance that astonished the old woman. When Naomi learned whose field Ruth had been working in, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. The word redeemer opens a door in the narrative that leads to everything that follows. In Hebrew, the word is goel, and it refers to a specific legal role within the extended family. The Goel was the kinsman redeemer, the nearest male relative who bore responsibility for protecting the family's interests in times of crisis. If a family member fell into poverty and had to sell his land, the Goel had the right and the obligation to buy it back, to redeem it, to keep the property within the clan. If a family member was sold into slavery, the Goel could pay the price to set him free. And if a man died without an heir, the Goel could marry the widow and produce a child who would carry the dead man's name and inherit his estate. The kinsman redeemer was the family's safety net, the person who stepped in when the normal mechanisms of provision and protection had failed. Boaz was a Goel for the family of Elimelech. He had the legal standing to redeem the land that Elimelech had left behind. He had the legal standing to marry Ruth and produce an heir in the name of her dead husband, Mahlon. He had the standing, and Naomi, whose bitterness had blinded her to everything except her own suffering, suddenly saw a possibility she had not dared to consider. The emptiness she had proclaimed at the gate of Bethlehem might not be permanent. There might yet be a future. But Naomi did not act immediately. She waited. She watched. She let the harvest continue. Let Ruth and Boaz develop whatever was developing between them in the daily rhythms of the field. And then, when the harvest was over and the time had come for the threshing, Naomi made her move. "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" she said to Ruth. "Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." The instructions are among the most debated in biblical scholarship, because they contain a layer of ambiguity that the text never fully resolves, and that may be deliberate. Wash and anoint yourself is the language of preparation for a romantic encounter, a woman making herself attractive for a man. Put on your cloak may mean her best garment, her wedding quality clothing, the opposite of the widow's garments she had been wearing. Do not make yourself known until he has finished eating and drinking means wait until he is relaxed, well-fed, and perhaps a little drunk, which is either a shrewd piece of social strategy or a morally questionable manipulation, depending on how much charity you extend to Naomi's motives. And uncover his feet and lie down is the phrase that has generated the most controversy, because in Hebrew the word feet is sometimes used as a euphemism for something else entirely, and the act of uncovering a man's lower body while he sleeps, and then lying down beside him, carries connotations that the English translation politely obscures. The question of what happened on the threshing floor is one that the text deliberately declines to answer with full clarity. The scene can be read as entirely chaste. Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet to wake him, lay down at his feet in a posture of submission, and asked him to exercise his role as kinsman redeemer. It can also be read as something more charged. Ruth presented herself to Boaz as a woman available for marriage, using the physical intimacy of the encounter to make her intentions unmistakable, relying on the privacy and the darkness and the wine in his blood to create a moment in which Boaz would have to respond. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the refusal of the text to resolve the ambiguity is itself a statement. The narrator does not want you to be comfortable. The narrator wants you to sit with the uncertainty, to feel the risk that Ruth was taking, to understand that what she did on that threshing floor was either an act of extraordinary faith or an act of extraordinary audacity, or, most likely, both at the same time. Ruth went. She did everything Naomi told her. She washed. She anointed herself. She put on her cloak. She went to the threshing floor and watched from a distance as Boaz ate and drank, and his heart was merry. When he lay down at the end of the heap of grain, she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, Boaz woke with a start. Something was wrong. The air was cold on his exposed skin. He turned over and was startled to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. And the question, spoken in the dark, on a threshing floor, in the middle of the night, is one of the most charged moments in the entire book. "I am Ruth, your servant," she answered. "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." The word she used for wings was kanaf, the same word Boaz had used when he blessed her in the field, when he prayed that God would shelter her under his wings. Ruth was taking Boaz's own prayer and turning it back on him. "You prayed that God would cover me with his wings. Now I am asking you to be the answer to your own prayer. Spread your kanaf over me." The word also means the corner or edge of a garment, and to spread your garment over a woman was a symbol of marriage, of claiming her as your own, of wrapping her in your protection. Ruth was proposing marriage. She was doing it in the dark, on a threshing floor, at midnight, lying at the feet of a man who had been drinking. And she was doing it with a theological precision that suggests she had thought about this moment for a very long time. Boaz's response was not what a cynic might expect. He did not recoil. He did not accuse her of impropriety. He did not remind her that she was a Moabite and he was an Israelite, and the law said the two should not mix. He blessed her. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." The first kindness was her loyalty to Naomi. The last kindness was her choice to seek redemption through the proper channels, through the kinsman redeemer, rather than pursuing a younger man who might have given her pleasure, but could not have given her legitimacy within the family of Elimelech. Boaz was saying, in effect, that Ruth had chosen duty over desire, had chosen the hard path that honored the dead over the easy path that served only the living. And he was moved by it. But there was a complication. Boaz told Ruth that while he was indeed a Goel, a kinsman redeemer, he was not the nearest one. Another man, whose name the text never gives, who is referred to only as Peloni Almoni, a Hebrew phrase roughly equivalent to so-and-so, had a closer claim. The law required that this nearer kinsman be given the first opportunity to redeem. If he accepted, the obligation and the privilege would be his. If he declined, it would pass to Boaz. "Remain tonight," Boaz told Ruth, "and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." She lay down at his feet until morning, but she rose before one person could recognize another, because Boaz said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." The secrecy was protective. Whatever had or had not happened on the threshing floor, the appearance of a woman leaving a man's sleeping place at dawn would have been enough to destroy both their reputations. Boaz, who had been scrupulously honorable throughout the entire encounter, was now being scrupulously practical. He gave Ruth 6 measures of barley, a generous gift and a sign of his intentions, and sent her home. When Ruth returned to Naomi and told her everything that had happened, Naomi's response revealed that the bitter old woman who had renamed herself Mara was waking up. "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Naomi knew Boaz. She knew his character. She knew that a man who had blessed Ruth in the field, who had protected her from harassment, who had pulled extra grain from the sheaves for her, who had spoken to her with tenderness and prayed over her with sincerity, was not going to let a legal technicality stand between them. Boaz would act. Boaz would settle it. And Boaz would do it today. That morning, Boaz went to the gate of Bethlehem, which was the public square, the courthouse, the marketplace, and the civic center of any Israelite town. Legal transactions were conducted at the gate, in full view of the community, with witnesses present to ensure that agreements were binding and records were kept. Boaz sat down and waited. When the nearer kinsman passed by, Boaz called to him, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." The unnamed man sat. Boaz assembled 10 elders of the city to serve as witnesses, and then he laid out the case. "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The nearer kinsman's initial response was favorable. "I will redeem it," he said. The land was valuable. Adding Elimelech's property to his own holdings was good business. He saw no problem. And then Boaz played his hand. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." The additional clause changed everything. Buying the land was one thing. Marrying a Moabite widow and producing an heir in the name of a dead man was another, because any son born to Ruth would not be the kinsman's heir. That son would be legally regarded as the son of Mahlon, Ruth's dead husband, and would inherit the very land the kinsman had just purchased. The investment would be lost. The property would pass to another man's line. The kinsman would have spent his money to enrich a dead man's legacy while diminishing his own. "I cannot redeem it for myself," the man said, "lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." The refusal was financial, not moral. The man did not object to Ruth's nationality or her character. He objected to the economics. He did not want to pay for land that would end up belonging to someone else's son. And so he took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz, which was the customary way of formalizing the transfer of a legal right. The shoe was the symbol of the transaction, the ancient equivalent of signing a contract. The unnamed kinsman walked away, his inheritance intact, his sandal missing, his name forgotten by history. He is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as the man who said no. Boaz said yes. Standing at the gate, before the 10 elders and all the people, Boaz declared, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place." The people at the gate and the elders responded with a blessing that unfolds like a prophecy. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." The invocation of Perez and Tamar is not accidental. The elders of Bethlehem, blessing the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, reached back into the story we have already heard and pulled it forward. They compared Ruth to Tamar, the woman who secured the line of Judah through scandal and desperation. They compared Boaz to Judah, the man who was confronted with his own failure and responded with honesty. They were saying, perhaps without fully understanding the implications, that this marriage was not merely a local union between a wealthy landowner and a foreign widow. It was a repetition of the pattern, a recurrence of the theme, another moment in which the line of Judah, the messianic line, the line that would one day produce the Christ, was being preserved through means that nobody would have planned and that everybody looking back would recognize as providential. Boaz married Ruth. She conceived. She bore a son. And the women of Bethlehem, the same women who had watched Naomi stumble through the gate and rename herself bitter, now gathered around her with a different kind of song. Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. 7 sons. In a culture where sons were the measure of a woman's worth and blessing, the women of Bethlehem declared that Ruth, a single Moabite daughter-in-law, was worth more than 7 of them. The statement is not merely generous, it is revolutionary. It overturns every assumption about value, about nationality, about the hierarchy of relationships that governed Israelite society. The foreign widow who should not have been there was worth more than the fullest possible complement of sons. The empty woman was full. The bitter woman had been given sweetness. And the child who had been born, the child who was laid in Naomi's arms, the child whom the neighbors named, was the living proof that the God who had, in Naomi's accusation, brought her back empty, had in fact been working through her emptiness the entire time. They named the child Obed, which means servant or worshiper. And the closing lines of the book of Ruth, delivered in the cadence of a genealogy, trace the descent forward. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. David, the shepherd boy of Bethlehem who would kill a giant, unite a nation, establish a dynasty, write the psalms that the world still sings, and become the king through whom the messianic promise would be carried forward to its ultimate fulfillment. David, the great-grandson of a Moabite widow who gleaned barley in a stranger's field. David, the descendant of Boaz and Ruth, of Salmon and Rahab, of Judah and Tamar. The line that was never supposed to include foreigners ran through 3 of them in 4 generations. Ruth had walked a long road from Moab to Bethlehem. She had refused to go home when every argument in the world told her to turn back. She had gleaned in a field that she happened to wander into by a chance that was not chance. She had gone to a threshing floor at midnight and asked a man to spread his wing over her. And from all of it, from the refusal and the gleaning and the midnight encounter and the marriage and the child, came the king. The Moabite prohibition said she should never enter the assembly of the Lord. She entered anyway. And God, it turned out, had been waiting for her at the gate. But the line does not end with David. It continues through him, through his triumphs and his failures, through the kingdom he built and the sins he committed, through the psalms he sang and the crimes he concealed. And the darkest chapter in David's story, the chapter that nearly broke the line and certainly broke the man, begins not in a battlefield or a throne room, but on a rooftop, on a warm evening in Jerusalem, when a king who should have been at war was home instead, and he looked down from his palace and saw a woman bathing. It was the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. The phrase is a clock and an accusation at the same time. Spring was the season of war in the ancient Near East, the narrow window after the winter rains had stopped, and before the summer heat made movement unbearable. When the roads were dry and the grain was high enough to feed an advancing army off the land, kings went to war in the spring. It was what kings did. It was expected and seasonal, as natural as the harvest. David had gone to war every spring for years, leading his armies in person, sleeping in the field with his soldiers, risking his body alongside the men who had followed him since the days when he was a fugitive running from Saul. But this spring, David sent Joab. He sent his commanders. He sent all Israel. And David remained in Jerusalem. The text does not explain why. It does not say he was ill, or that his advisers urged him to stay, or that the campaign was minor enough to delegate. It simply notes that he remained. And the verb it uses carries the faint scent of indolence, of a man who has grown comfortable in his palace, who has begun to let others fight his wars, who has settled into the dangerous ease that comes to powerful men when they have been powerful long enough to forget what earned them the power in the first place. David was not young anymore. He had killed Goliath as a teenager. He had spent years hiding in caves, running from Saul, leading a band of outlaws through the wilderness of Judah. He had united the 12 tribes, conquered Jerusalem, brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city with dancing and sacrifice, and established a kingdom that stretched from the borders of Egypt to the Euphrates. He had done everything. And now, in the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle, he was on his roof. The roof of the palace in Jerusalem overlooked the city. The houses of the capital were built on a slope, descending from the palace complex at the highest point, down into the lower quarters where the ordinary residents lived. From his rooftop, David could see into courtyards, onto terraces, across the flat roofs where women dried their laundry and families slept on warm nights. It was late afternoon or early evening. The text says he rose from his couch, suggesting he had been sleeping, a nap in the heat of the day, the kind of luxury available to a man with no battles to fight and no obligations pressing on his conscience. He got up. He walked on the roof, and he saw a woman bathing. The bathing was not unusual. In a city without indoor plumbing, people bathed where they could, often on the rooftop or in the courtyard, using water carried from the cistern. The text specifies that the woman was very beautiful, a detail that matters because it establishes the nature of David's response. He did not see a woman and feel compassion or curiosity or the casual recognition that one human being gives another. He saw a woman and he wanted her. The beauty was the trigger. What followed was the mechanism. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. The response he received was layered with warning, though David chose not to hear it. Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? 3 identifiers, each one a fence that should have kept the king on his roof and out of someone else's marriage. She was Bathsheba, a named woman, not a nameless stranger. She was the daughter of Eliam, which means she came from a family of standing. Eliam was likely the son of Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted counselors, which made Bathsheba the granddaughter of a man who sat in the king's inner circle. And she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, which meant she was married, and her husband was not some anonymous peasant, but a soldier, one of David's own elite warriors, a member of the select group known as the 30, the greatest fighters in the kingdom. Every piece of information David received should have stopped him. She was connected. She was married. Her husband was one of his own men. Any one of those facts should have been enough. David heard all 3 and sent messengers to get her. The text is brutally compressed. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. 4 verbs: sent, took, came, lay. The compression is the point. There was no courtship, no seduction, at least not in the sense of a gradual process of persuasion. A king sent for a woman, and the woman came, because when a king sends messengers to your house, you do not have the option of saying no. The power differential between a monarch and a subject, between the commander of the nation's armies and the wife of one of his soldiers, is so vast that the question of consent becomes almost meaningless. Bathsheba may have been willing. She may have been terrified. She may have felt honored or violated or some impossible combination of both. The text does not tell us what she felt, because the text is not interested at this point in Bathsheba's interior life. It is interested in David's crime, and the crime is the taking. He saw, he wanted, he sent, he took. The grammar of power and desire stripped to its bones. The text adds one clinical detail that matters enormously for what comes next. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. The phrase refers to the ritual purification that Jewish law required after menstruation. Bathsheba had just completed her period, which means she was at the point in her cycle when conception was most likely, and it also means with absolute certainty that whatever child resulted from this encounter could not possibly be her husband's. Uriah was at the front. He had not been home. The timing eliminated any ambiguity. If Bathsheba became pregnant, the child was David's, and everyone who could count to 9 would know it. Bathsheba went home. Time passed. And then she sent David a message, 2 words in the Hebrew, pregnant with more than their literal meaning. I am pregnant. The message was a grenade thrown into the palace. In the law of Israel, adultery was punishable by death for both parties. If the pregnancy became public, Bathsheba faced execution. David faced a scandal that could destroy his reign. The man who had been anointed by God, the king whose dynasty was supposed to last forever, the poet who sang of God's righteousness and mercy, had committed a crime that his own laws said should cost him his life. And now the evidence was growing inside the body of a woman whose husband was away at war, fighting the war that David should have been fighting, on the battlefield where David should have been standing. David's response was not repentance. It was not confession. It was a cover-up. And the cover-up began with a plan so coldly logical that it reveals a mind operating at full tactical capacity, the mind of a general who had spent decades outmaneuvering enemies, now turned to the task of outmaneuvering the truth. He sent word to Joab at the front. "Send me Uriah the Hittite." Joab complied. Uriah came to Jerusalem, stood before David, and reported on the progress of the war. David listened, nodded, asked questions about Joab and the army and the campaign, playing the part of a concerned commander-in-chief with impeccable composure. And then he told Uriah to go home. "Go down to your house and wash your feet," David said, which was a polite euphemism for "go home and sleep with your wife." David even sent a present after him, food from the royal table, a generous gift designed to put Uriah in a festive and romantic mood. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. If Uriah slept with Bathsheba, the pregnancy could be attributed to his visit. The timing would be close enough. The scandal would be averted. No one would know. But Uriah did not go home. He slept at the door of the king's house with the servants, on the stone floor, in the open air. When David was told in the morning that Uriah had not gone down to his house, he summoned the soldier and asked why. The question was casual, but the stakes behind it were enormous. David needed Uriah in his wife's bed. Everything depended on it. Uriah's answer was a sermon delivered by a man who had no idea he was preaching to a sinner. The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house, to eat and to drink, and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. The words must have landed on David like blows. The ark was in the field. The army was sleeping in tents. Joab, David's general, was exposed to danger and discomfort. And Uriah, a Hittite by birth, A foreigner who had adopted Israel's God and Israel's cause was unwilling to enjoy the comforts of home while his brothers in arms suffered in the open. The irony is scalding. Uriah, the Hittite, was more devoted to the covenant and to his comrades than David, the anointed king of Israel, who was hiding in his palace trying to conceal an adultery. Uriah's honor was David's condemnation. Every word Uriah spoke about duty and solidarity, and the refusal to indulge himself while others sacrificed, was a mirror held up to David's face, reflecting back an image the king could not bear to look at. David tried again. He kept Uriah in Jerusalem another day and invited him to eat and drink at the royal table. He got Uriah drunk, deliberately, systematically, pouring wine until the soldier's judgment was impaired, hoping that alcohol would succeed where honor had failed. A drunk man might forget his principles. A drunk man might stumble home to his wife and wake up the next morning with no clear memory of what had happened. But Uriah, even drunk, even with the wine clouding his vision and loosening his limbs, did not go home. He went back to the servants' quarters and slept on the floor. The man's integrity was structural. It did not bend, not for the king, not for the wine, not for anything. David was out of options. The gentle approach had failed. The clever approach had failed. The approach lubricated by alcohol had failed. Uriah would not cooperate, would not do the one thing that David needed him to do, and every day that passed brought the pregnancy closer to visibility, closer to the point where no cover story would be plausible. David had entered the crisis as an adulterer. He was about to exit it as a murderer. He wrote a letter. He addressed it to Joab, his general, the man who commanded the army in the field, and he placed the letter in Uriah's hand and told him to carry it back to the front. The letter contained Uriah's death sentence, and Uriah, loyal and obedient and utterly ignorant of its contents, carried it himself, walking the road from Jerusalem to the siege lines with his own execution order tucked against his chest. The letter said, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die." The instruction was military in its language and murderous in its intent. Joab was to engineer a situation in which Uriah would be exposed to maximum danger and then abandoned by his fellow soldiers. It was to look like a casualty of war, a regrettable loss in the heat of battle, the kind of death that happens in every siege and that no one questions too closely. David was not wielding the sword himself. He was not even present at the killing. He was using the machinery of war, the apparatus of command, the obedience of his general, to commit murder at a distance, cleanly, without blood on his own hands. Joab obeyed. He was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders, and Joab was, in any case, not a man whose conscience was easily troubled. He had killed before on David's behalf, and would kill again. He assigned Uriah to a position near the wall of the besieged city, a place where the defenders' arrows and stones could reach the attackers, and when the fighting began, the other soldiers pulled back, leaving Uriah exposed. The defenders rained down fire. Uriah fell. He was not the only casualty. Other soldiers died in the same assault, a detail that Joab anticipated David might need in order to explain the tactical decision. When the messenger arrived in Jerusalem to report the battle's progress, Joab gave him specific instructions. Tell the king about the casualties, and if the king becomes angry about the tactical error that cost so many lives, then add, "Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." The messenger delivered the report. David listened. And when the messenger reached the final line, when he said that Uriah the Hittite was among the dead, David's response was a master class in performative composure. "Thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. The sword devours now one and now another. The phrase is so callous, so perfectly calibrated to sound philosophical rather than guilty, that it almost defies belief. David was speaking about the man whose wife he had stolen and whose death he had ordered, and he was wrapping the murder in the language of military fatalism, as if Uriah's death were simply the cost of doing business, the price the army pays, the random cruelty of combat. Encourage him. Encourage Joab. Tell the general who carried out the murder that the king is pleased. The machinery is working. The cover-up is complete. Bathsheba mourned. When she heard that Uriah was dead, she lamented for her husband. The text records her grief without qualifying it, without telling us whether she mourned because she loved him, or because custom required it, or because she understood or suspected what David had done to bring about his death. Her mourning is a silence in the story, a closed door behind which we cannot see. What we can see is what happened next. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. And then the text delivers its verdict in a single sentence that falls like the stroke of a blade. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. The Hebrew is stronger than the English. The word translated displeased carries the force of something loathsome, something evil in the eyes of God, something that provoked not mere disappointment, but active anger. David had taken another man's wife. David had murdered a loyal soldier. David had corrupted the machinery of his own government to conceal the crime. David had used his power as king to destroy a man who had done nothing wrong, and whose only fault was a level of integrity that made the king's cover story impossible. And God, who had anointed David, who had given him the kingdom, who had promised him a dynasty, who had called him a man after his own heart, was angry. God sent Nathan. Nathan was a prophet, which in biblical terms means he was a man who spoke for God, who carried messages from the divine realm to the human one, who said things that no one wanted to hear, and said them to the people who least wanted to hear them. Prophets in Israel were not courtiers. They were not yes-men. They were the conscience of the nation made vocal, and they operated with a terrifying independence, answerable to God and to no one else. Nathan had previously delivered to David the covenant promise that his dynasty would endure forever. Now he was being sent back to the same king with a very different message. Nathan did not accuse David directly. He told him a story. There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. The parable was a trap, and it was constructed with surgical precision. The rich man was David, with his palace and his harem and his wealth and his armies. The poor man was Uriah, who had nothing but one wife, one lamb, one small and precious thing that he loved. The traveler was David's desire, the appetite that arrived unbidden and demanded satisfaction. And the act of taking, the rich man's seizure of the poor man's only possession when he had flocks of his own, was the act of a man so accustomed to having what he wanted that he could not conceive of a want that should go unfulfilled. The parable worked because it engaged David's sense of justice without triggering his sense of guilt. David did not hear himself in the story. He heard a crime committed by someone else, and his response was immediate and furious. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. David pronounced judgment on himself. He condemned the act without recognizing the actor. He reached for the maximum penalty, death, and then added a financial restitution, fourfold restoration, that came directly from the law of Israel governing theft. He was outraged. His sense of justice was intact. His moral compass, when pointed at someone else's behavior, worked perfectly. It was only when the compass was turned inward that it spun wildly and pointed nowhere. Nathan looked at the king, and he said 4 words that shattered the palace like a thunderbolt. "You are the man, Ata Haish. You, the man. Not someone in a parable, not a hypothetical rich man in a hypothetical city. You, David, sitting on your throne, wearing your crown, surrounded by your courtiers, are the man who took the poor man's lamb. You are the thief. You are the one without pity. You pronounced the sentence. Now hear it applied to yourself." Nathan did not stop. The words poured out of him like water through a broken dam, and every sentence was a blow. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." God was not speaking in abstractions. He was listing gifts. "I anointed you. I delivered you. I gave you the kingdom. I gave you wealth. I gave you power. I would have given you more, and you despised it all." The word despised is devastating in context, because it implies not merely that David broke a rule, but that he treated God's generosity with contempt, that he looked at everything he had been given and decided it was not enough, that he saw a woman who belonged to someone else and concluded that his desire outweighed another man's life. And then came the consequence. "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." The punishment was not a single event, but a permanent condition. Violence would follow David's family like a shadow, generation after generation, brother rising against brother, son against father. The cycle of bloodshed, inaugurated by David's own crime, replaying itself through his descendants. The prophecy would prove terrifyingly accurate. Amnon would rape his half-sister Tamar. Absalom would kill Amnon, and then lead a rebellion against David, publicly sleeping with David's concubines on the palace roof, the same roof from which David had seen Bathsheba. Before being killed in battle by Joab, Adonijah would attempt to seize the throne and be executed by Solomon. The house of David would be magnificent and doomed, glorious and blood-soaked, and the violence would begin now with the child. Nathan told David that the child Bathsheba was carrying would die. David's response, at last, was what it should have been from the beginning. He did not make excuses. He did not blame Bathsheba. He did not argue that Uriah's death was a military necessity, or that the affair was a momentary lapse. He said 3 words, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die." The forgiveness was immediate, but not total. David would live. The dynasty would continue, but the child would not survive, and the consequences of the sin would reverberate through the generations that followed. The child was born, and immediately he was struck with a severe illness. David fasted. He lay on the ground all night, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing to rise. His servants were alarmed. They had never seen the king like this, prostrate on the floor, weeping, pleading with a God who had already pronounced the sentence. The elders of his household stood over him, urging him to get up, to eat, to wash, But David would not. For 7 days the child lingered, and for 7 days David lay on the ground, and on the 7th day the child died. The servants were afraid to tell him. If he had been this distraught while the child was alive, what would he do when he learned the child was dead? They whispered among themselves, anxious, watching the king lying motionless on the floor. But David saw them whispering and understood. "Is the child dead?" he asked. They said, "He is dead." And then David did something that astonished everyone who witnessed it. He rose from the ground. He washed. He anointed himself. He changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And then he went to his own house and asked for food, and he ate. His servants could not understand. "What is this thing that you have done?" they asked. "You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food." David's answer was one of the most extraordinary statements of faith and grief in the entire Bible. "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me.'" The theology is stark. While there was hope, David poured himself out in prayer and fasting, hoping to change God's mind, hoping that the sentence might be commuted, hoping that grace might override justice. When hope was gone, David accepted the verdict. He did not rage against God. He did not renounce his faith. He did not collapse into a grief from which he could not recover. He got up, he worshipped, he ate, and he spoke about his dead son with a tenderness that acknowledged both the finality of death and the endurance of love. "I shall go to him. I cannot bring him back, but one day I will go to where he is." The grief was not gone. It was contained, held inside a faith large enough to accommodate both the justice of God and the suffering of a father who had brought that justice upon himself. David went to Bathsheba. He comforted her. The verb is gentle and intimate, suggesting a tenderness between them that the narrative, until this point, had not revealed. Whatever their relationship had been at its inception, however coercive or compromised to the beginning, something had grown between them in the furnace of shared loss. David comforted Bathsheba, and he lay with her, and she bore a son, and they called his name Solomon. And then the text adds a line that transforms everything. "And the Lord loved him." The Lord loved Solomon. The child born to the woman taken from another man, the son of a union that began in adultery and was consecrated in murder, was loved by God. The prophet Nathan came and gave the child a second name, Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. The name was a message. God's anger at David was real. God's punishment was real. The dead child was real. The sword that would haunt David's house was real. But so was this, that from the wreckage, from the sin and the consequence and the grief, God was bringing something forward. Solomon would become the wisest king Israel ever knew. Solomon would build the temple that David had dreamed of, the house of God in Jerusalem that would become the center of Israelite worship for centuries. Solomon would write proverbs and songs and would reign over a kingdom so prosperous that the wealth of Israel became legendary throughout the ancient world. And Solomon's line would carry the messianic promise forward, generation after generation, until a descendant of his would be born in the town where David had once been a shepherd boy, in a stable in the dark. But between David and that stable lay decades of Bathsheba's life that the narrative only partially illuminates. And what it does reveal shows a woman who was not merely a victim of royal power, but who became, over time, a figure of considerable influence in her own right. Bathsheba disappears from the story for most of Solomon's childhood and youth. She reemerges in the first chapter of the book of Kings, when David is old dying, confined to his bed, and the question of succession has become the most dangerous question in the kingdom. David had many sons by many wives, and the eldest surviving son, Adonijah, assumed that the throne was his by right of birth. He assembled a coalition of supporters, including Joab the general and Abiathar the priest. And he held a public feast to declare himself king, inviting the nobles and princes of Judah, but conspicuously excluding Solomon, Nathan the prophet, and the palace guard. The coup was unfolding in real time, and if it succeeded, Solomon would at best be sidelined and at worst be killed, because new kings in the ancient world routinely executed their rivals to secure the throne. It was Nathan who saw the danger first, and it was Nathan who went to Bathsheba. "Have you not heard that Adonijah the son of Haggith has become king, and David our Lord does not know it?" he said. "Now therefore come, let me give you advice, that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon." Nathan's counsel was strategic. Bathsheba was to go to David, remind him of the oath he had sworn that Solomon would succeed him, and ask why Adonijah was sitting on the throne. Nathan would then enter the room and confirm her words, presenting the king with a unified front that would force him to act. Bathsheba went to the king. She found him in his chamber, old and frail, attended by servants. She bowed, she knelt, and she spoke with the composure and precision of a woman who had survived the worst things that power can do and had learned in the surviving how power works. "My lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne.' And now, behold, Adonijah is king, although you, my lord the king, do not know it." She laid out the facts. She named the conspirators. She described the feast. And she ended with a question that was also a warning. "Otherwise it will come to pass, when my lord the king lies down with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be counted as offenders." The word offenders is a euphemism for the dead. If Adonijah took the throne, Bathsheba and Solomon would be eliminated. She was not being dramatic. She was being accurate. The history of monarchical succession in the ancient world was written in blood, and Bathsheba knew it. She had already lost one child. She was not going to lose another. David heard her. Nathan entered and confirmed her account. And the old king, rousing himself from the lethargy of age and illness, issued a decree that was as decisive as any command he had given in his prime. "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my soul out of every adversity, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. Even so will I do this day.'" Solomon was anointed at the spring of Gihon, in a ceremony so public and so emphatic that the sound of the trumpets and the shouting of the people reached Adonijah's feast and sent his guests scattering in panic. The coup collapsed. Adonijah fled to the altar, grasping the horns of the sanctuary, begging for his life. Solomon spared him, for the moment, though the reprieve would not last. The throne was secured, the line was preserved, and Bathsheba, the woman David had taken from another man's house, the woman whose first child had died as a consequence of the king's sin, the woman who had been silent through most of the narrative, had spoken at the moment that mattered most, and her words had saved her son and changed the dynasty. Under Solomon's reign, Bathsheba held the title of Gebirah, the queen mother, a position of formal honor and genuine influence in the royal court. When Solomon sat on his throne, Bathsheba sat at his right hand. When petitioners came to the palace, they sometimes came through her, knowing that the king's mother had his ear. She was no longer the woman bathing on a rooftop. She was no longer the silent figure who sent a two-word message to a king who had wronged her. She was the mother of the king, the Gebirah, the woman whose intervention had preserved the line through which the Messiah would come. Her story does not resolve into a tidy moral. It cannot be reduced to a lesson about the dangers of lust, or the justice of God, or the resilience of women, though all of those themes are present. What it can be is what it is, a story about a woman who entered the biblical narrative as an object of desire and exited it as a queen, who was taken by force and ended up shaping the succession of the most important monarchy in Israel's history, who lost a child to the consequences of another man's sin and raised a child who would be called beloved of the Lord. She is the crack in the foundation of the house of David, and she is also the mortar that held it together when it threatened to split apart. Matthew, writing his genealogy centuries later, refused to use her name. He called her the wife of Uriah, and the choice was not accidental. He wanted his readers to remember the husband. He wanted them to feel the weight of what David did, to understand that the line of the Messiah ran directly through the worst act of the best king, that the ancestry of the Son of God included not just foreigners and prostitutes and women who played the harlot by the roadside, but also a murder, a cover-up, a dead soldier, and a child who did not survive his first week. If the previous women in the genealogy proved that God works through the unexpected, Bathsheba proves that God works through the unforgivable, not by excusing it, not by minimizing it, but by refusing to let it have the last word. The line continued. Through Solomon, through the kings who followed, through the exile and the return, and through the centuries of waiting and silence, when no prophet spoke, and no pillar of fire appeared, and the people of Israel held onto the promise the way a drowning man holds onto a plank, because letting go was not an option, not because holding on made sense. The line continued all the way down to a man named Joseph, a carpenter in a nothing town called Nazareth, who was engaged to be married to a young woman, and who discovered, before the wedding, that she was already pregnant, and that the child was not his. The echo of Bathsheba's story is unmistakable. Another pregnancy, another man who is not the father. Another moment in which the clean narrative, the respectable story, the version of events that the neighbors would approve of, is shattered by something that should not have happened. But this time, the story is not about sin. This time, the scandal is not a scandal at all. This time, something is happening that has never happened before and will never happen again, and the only people who know the truth are a frightened girl and an angel whose name means, God is my strength. Nazareth was the kind of place people left, not the kind of place people came to. It sat in the hill country of Galilee, a small village of perhaps a few hundred inhabitants, perched on a ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley, far from the centers of power and learning that defined Jewish life in the first century. Jerusalem was to the south, several days' walk, the city of the temple, the seat of whatever remained of Israel's political authority under the crushing weight of Roman occupation. The great rabbinic academies were elsewhere. The wealth was elsewhere. The history was elsewhere. Nazareth produced nothing that the wider world noticed. No prophets, no scholars, no famous sons whose exploits were recounted in the marketplaces of the larger cities. When a man named Nathanael, a few decades later, would hear that the Messiah had come from Nazareth, his response would be instinctive and unfiltered. Can anything good come from Nazareth? The question was not a theological objection. It was a geographical one. Nazareth was nowhere. Everyone knew it. It was in this nowhere place, in a house we cannot locate, on a day we cannot identify, that a young woman received a visitor who was not human. Her name was Miriam, which we render as Mary, and the name itself carried echoes that a Jewish girl would have felt in her bones. The original Miriam was the sister of Moses. the woman who had watched over her infant brother as he floated in a basket on the Nile, who had danced on the far shore of the Red Sea after the drowning of Pharaoh's army, who had challenged Moses' authority and been struck with leprosy and then healed. The name meant bitterness, or rebellion, or beloved, depending on which etymology you followed. And all three meanings would prove relevant before the story was over. Mary was young. How young, the text does not say precisely, but the customs of first-century Jewish life provide a reliable estimate. Betrothal typically occurred when a girl was between 12 and 14, with the formal marriage following a year later. Mary was betrothed to Joseph, which meant the legal commitment had been made, the bride price paid, the contract sealed before witnesses, but the wedding had not yet taken place, and she had not yet moved into Joseph's home. Betrothal in Jewish law was not the same as modern engagement. It was a binding legal agreement, as enforceable as marriage itself, and could only be dissolved through a formal divorce. A betrothed woman who was found to have been unfaithful was subject to the same penalties as a married woman. The distinction between betrothal and marriage was not one of commitment, but of cohabitation. Mary was legally Joseph's. She was not yet living with him. And it was in this interval, this gap between the contract and the consummation, that everything happened. The angel Gabriel came to her. Luke's Gospel provides the account of the Annunciation, and the details he preserved have the texture of something remembered with extraordinary vividness, as if the moment had been seared into the memory of whoever first told the story and had survived, undimmed, through however many retellings it took to reach Luke's pen. Gabriel came to Mary and said, "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you." The salutation was unusual. Angels in the Hebrew Bible do not typically begin with pleasantries. They begin with commands, or warnings, or the name of God. Gabriel's opening was almost gentle, a greeting that acknowledged Mary as a person before delivering the message that would reshape her life. But the gentleness did not prevent the fear. Luke says Mary was greatly troubled by the saying and tried to discern what sort of greeting this was. She was not troubled by the appearance of the angel, or at least the text does not emphasize that. She was troubled by the words, by the strange warmth of the address, by the implication that she had been singled out for something she had not asked for and could not yet understand. Gabriel continued, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Every phrase was a detonation. You will conceive, you will bear a son. His name will be Jesus, Yeshua in Hebrew, meaning God saves. The same name as Joshua, the man who had led Israel into the promised land. He will be called the Son of the Most High. He will sit on the throne of David. His kingdom will have no end. Gabriel was not delivering a modest announcement. He was declaring the arrival of the Messiah, the fulfillment of every prophecy that Israel had clung to through centuries of exile and occupation and diminished hope, and he was declaring it to a teenage girl in a village that the rest of the world had never heard of. Mary's response was not disbelief. It was a question, and the question was practical, grounded, almost clinical in its precision. How will this be, since I am a virgin? The question is often compared to Zechariah's response to Gabriel earlier in Luke's narrative. Zechariah, the elderly priest, had been told that his wife Elizabeth would bear a son in her old age, and his response was, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." Gabriel struck Zechariah mute for his doubt, but Mary asked an apparently similar question and received no punishment. The difference is not always easy to articulate, but it seems to lie in the direction of the question. Zechariah was asking for proof. How shall I know? He wanted evidence. He wanted a sign. He was a priest in the temple, surrounded by the apparatus of God's presence, and he still needed to be convinced. Mary was asking for method. How will this be? She was not doubting that it would happen. She was asking how, because the mechanism was not obvious, because she knew her own body, and she knew she had not been with a man, and she needed to understand what was about to happen to her physically, practically, in the flesh. Gabriel's answer was the most extraordinary sentence in the New Testament. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. The language is dense with allusion. The word overshadow evokes the cloud of God's presence that had descended on the tabernacle in the wilderness, the Shekinah glory that filled the Holy of Holies, the visible manifestation of divine power resting upon a physical space. Gabriel was telling Mary that what had once happened to a tent in the desert was about to happen to her body. The presence that had filled the tabernacle would fill her womb. The glory that the priests approached with fear and trembling, removing their sandals, averting their eyes, would take up residence inside a girl from Nazareth, growing cell by cell, bone by bone, becoming flesh in the most literal and terrifying sense imaginable. And then Gabriel offered her a sign, unprompted, a piece of information that served as both confirmation and comfort. And behold, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. Elizabeth was pregnant. Elizabeth, the elderly wife of the priest Zechariah, the woman who had spent her entire life unable to conceive, was 6 months along with the child who would become John the Baptist. The sign was personal, intimate, drawn from Mary's own family circle. God was not pointing to the stars or splitting the ground or doing anything dramatic enough to attract public attention. He was pointing to a cousin, to a pregnancy that Mary could verify by visiting, to a miracle that was small enough to be hidden in the body of an old woman in the hill country of Judea, but large enough to prove that the God who was asking Mary to carry his son was already at work in ways she could see and touch. Mary's answer came, and it came without hesitation, without negotiation, without the conditions and qualifications that a more cautious person might have attached to so overwhelming a request. Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. Let it be. The phrase is submissive and explosive at the same time. Mary was consenting. She was agreeing to become pregnant, unmarried, in a culture where an unmarried pregnant woman could be divorced, publicly shamed, or worse. She was agreeing to carry a child that she could not explain to Joseph, to her parents, to the neighbors who would count the months between the wedding and the birth. She was agreeing to a miracle that would look from the outside exactly like a sin. She was saying yes to a joy that would be wrapped in scandal, a blessing that would be dressed in the clothes of disgrace, a gift that she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who had no reason to believe her. And the angel departed from her. The silence after Gabriel left must have been immense. Mary was alone in her house in Nazareth, with the angel's words still ringing in the air, and the Holy Spirit, if the conception was immediate, already at work within her body. She was the only person in the world who knew what had just happened. No one else had seen the angel. No one else had heard the message. No one else could confirm that this pregnancy, when it became visible, was anything other than what every pregnancy outside of marriage appeared to be. Evidence of a woman who had broken her vows. Mary went to Elizabeth. She left Nazareth and traveled south into the hill country of Judea, a journey of several days, to visit the one person who might understand what was happening to her. When she arrived and greeted Elizabeth, the child in Elizabeth's womb leaped, and Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, cried out, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" Elizabeth knew. She knew without being told, without explanation, without evidence. The Holy Spirit told her, and she believed, and she called Mary the mother of my Lord, a phrase that acknowledged both the humanity of the child Mary was carrying and the divinity that Elizabeth's spirit recognized. For Mary, the confirmation must have been like air to a drowning woman. Someone else knew. Someone else believed. She was not alone. Mary's response to Elizabeth's greeting was the Magnificat, one of the most beautiful and subversive poems in Scripture. "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked on the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name." The song continued, and as it continued, it expanded beyond the personal into the political, beyond the intimate into the cosmic. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. The Magnificat is a revolutionary document masquerading as a lullaby. It announces, in the voice of a pregnant teenager, the inversion of every power structure the world had ever known. The mighty brought down, the humble exalted, the hungry filled, the rich emptied. Mary was not singing about a vague spiritual hope or a distant eschatological promise. She was singing about what God was already doing in her body, in that moment, taking the lowest, the smallest, the most invisible person in the social order, a peasant girl from a village that the empire had never noticed, and making her the carrier of the world's redemption. The revolution started in a womb. The throne room was a uterus. The coronation was an embryo dividing and multiplying in the dark. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for 3 months, through the final trimester of Elizabeth's pregnancy, and then she returned to Nazareth. And it is here that the story shifts from Luke's account to Matthew's, and it is here that the silence becomes deafening, because Matthew tells us what happened next from Joseph's perspective, and Joseph's perspective is the sound of a man's world collapsing. Matthew says simply, "Before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit." The phrase, "before they came together," means before the marriage was consummated, before Mary had moved into Joseph's house, before any physical union had taken place between them. And the phrase, "she was found to be with child," means the pregnancy had become visible, undeniable, impossible to conceal. Whether Mary told Joseph herself, or whether he discovered it through observation, or through the gossip that would have spread through a village of a few hundred people like fire through dry grass, the text does not say. What it says is that Joseph knew, and that what he knew broke him. Matthew describes Joseph as a just man, a righteous man, using the same word, dikaios, that the Greek Old Testament uses to describe people who are in right relationship with God's law. Joseph was a man who took the law seriously, who understood its demands, who lived by its requirements. And the law was clear. A betrothed woman who was found pregnant by another man had violated the covenant, and the appropriate response was public divorce, a formal dissolution of the betrothal before witnesses, accompanied by the shame that such a proceeding would inevitably bring. In extreme interpretations, the penalty could be even harsher. Deuteronomy prescribed stoning for a betrothed virgin who lay with another man. Joseph had every legal right to expose Mary. He had every legal right to make her a public example. The law was on his side. But Joseph was not only just. He was, Matthew tells us, unwilling to put her to shame. The Greek word means to make a public spectacle, to expose someone to disgrace, to parade their failure before the community. Joseph did not want to do this. Whatever he felt, whatever rage or grief or bewilderment was churning inside him, he did not want to destroy Mary. He resolved to divorce her quietly, to dissolve the betrothal without public proceedings, to let her slip away with as much of her dignity intact as the situation allowed. The decision reveals a man whose righteousness was not merely legal but compassionate, a man who understood that justice without mercy is cruelty, a man who was willing to sacrifice his own reputation for the protection of a woman who, by every outward appearance, had betrayed him. Because make no mistake, that is what it looked like. From Joseph's perspective, Mary was pregnant and he was not the father. The only explanations available to a rational mind were the obvious ones, and none of them were flattering. She had been with another man. She had been unfaithful. The betrothal, the contract, the promise, all of it had been violated. Joseph may have loved her. The text does not say, but his desire to protect her from public shame suggests a tenderness that goes beyond legal obligation. And it was precisely that tenderness that made the betrayal, the apparent betrayal, so devastating. He was going to do the right thing. He was going to let her go gently. He was going to absorb the shame himself, because a man who divorces his betrothed quietly is a man who invites the community to speculate about his own reasons, his own failures, his own inadequacies. Joseph was prepared to be the subject of gossip, so that Mary would not be the subject of a trial. He had resolved this. He had made his decision. And then, in the night, an angel came. Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. The angel addressed Joseph as son of David, and the title was not honorary. Joseph was a descendant of David, a member of the royal line, the man through whom the legal claim to the throne of David would pass to the child Mary was carrying. The angel's message was three things at once: an explanation, a command, and a commission. The explanation: the pregnancy is not what you think. The child is not the product of infidelity. The Holy Spirit is the Father, and the conception is a miracle that has no precedent and requires no apology. The command, take Mary as your wife, do not divorce her, do not send her away. Do not let the apparent scandal prevent you from doing what God is asking you to do. And the commission, you will name the child. In Jewish culture, the act of naming was the father's prerogative. By naming the child, Joseph would be claiming him legally, adopting him into the house of David, conferring upon him the legal lineage that the Messiah required. The child would not be Joseph's biologically, but he would be Joseph's legally. And in the world of Jewish law, the legal claim was what mattered. Matthew pauses the narrative here to insert a theological comment, a rare moment where the author steps out from behind the curtain and addresses the reader directly. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. The prophecy was from Isaiah, spoken 7 centuries earlier, in a political context so different from Mary's situation that the connection would not have been obvious without divine interpretation. Isaiah had been speaking to King Ahaz during a military crisis, offering a sign of God's faithfulness. Matthew was saying that the sign Isaiah offered had a meaning deeper than its original context, that it pointed forward through the centuries to a moment when a virgin would conceive, and the child she bore would be God himself, wrapped in human flesh, dwelling among his people in the most literal sense the word with could sustain. Joseph woke up, and he did what the angel told him. He took Mary as his wife. He brought her into his home. He did not consummate the marriage until after the child was born, which Matthew notes with a specificity that suggests the detail mattered. Joseph wanted it known, or at least Matthew wanted it recorded, that the child was not his, that the virgin birth was not a cover story for a premature consummation, that whatever happened in Nazareth was exactly what the angel said it was and nothing else. But between the angel's visit and the birth, the Roman Empire intervened. Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and the census required every man to return to his ancestral city to be registered. For Joseph, a descendant of David, this meant Bethlehem, the city of David, the place where Samuel had anointed the shepherd boy, where Ruth had gleaned in the fields of Boaz, where Obed had been born and Jesse had raised his sons, and where the whole messianic line had first taken root. Joseph and Mary would have to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, a journey of roughly 80 miles, through the hill country, on foot, or on the back of a donkey, with Mary in the final weeks of her pregnancy. The journey would have taken several days, possibly a week, depending on the pace that a woman in Mary's condition could maintain. The roads were not empty. The census had set the entire province in motion, with families streaming toward their ancestral towns, clogging the highways, filling the inns, and turning the countryside into a slow-moving river of displaced humanity. By the time Joseph and Mary reached Bethlehem, the town was full. The inn had no room. The word Luke uses, kataluma, is sometimes translated as inn, but more accurately refers to a guest room, perhaps the upper room of a private home, where travelers were customarily received. The guest rooms were taken. Every spare corner was occupied, and Mary was about to give birth. They found shelter in a place where animals were kept. Luke does not say stable. He says Mary laid the child in a manger, a feeding trough, which implies that the birth took place wherever mangers were found, a cave behind a house, a ground floor room shared with livestock, a lean-to attached to an overcrowded dwelling. The location was not chosen for its symbolic value. It was the only space available. The King of Kings was born in a place where animals ate, because there was no room anywhere else, and because the parents who carried him had no money, no connections, no family in the city generous enough or available enough to take them in. Mary gave birth. She wrapped the child in strips of cloth, the swaddling bands that were the standard practice for newborns in the ancient world. Strips of linen wound tightly around the infant's body to keep the limbs straight and to provide a sense of warmth and security. And she laid him in the manger. The image is so familiar that its strangeness has been domesticated by centuries of Christmas cards and nativity plays and carol services. But strip away the familiarity and look at it fresh, and what you see is a scene of almost unbearable vulnerability. A first-time mother, barely more than a girl, in a room that smells of straw and animals, far from home, with a husband who is not the biological father, giving birth to a child whose true identity she cannot explain to anyone who was not visited by the same angel. The glory of the Incarnation, the moment when God entered human history as a participant rather than an observer, happened in a space so humble that the only witnesses were a bewildered carpenter and whatever livestock happened to be present. The shepherds came that night. Angels appeared to men, watching their flocks in the fields outside Bethlehem, the same fields where Ruth had gleaned, the same hills where David had tended his father's sheep. And the angels told them that the Messiah had been born, And the sign, the way they would recognize him, was this: they would find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger, not in a palace, not in the temple, not attended by priests or surrounded by soldiers or lying in a golden cradle, in a feeding trough, in the dark, in a room that smelled of hay. The shepherds went. They found Mary and Joseph and the baby, just as the angel had said. They told everyone what they had seen and heard, and Luke records that all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary, Luke says, treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. The verb pondering implies a sustained, ongoing process of reflection, a turning over and over of events and words and signs, trying to make sense of something that was too large to comprehend in a single moment. Mary did not understand everything that was happening. She could not. She was a girl who had said yes to an angel and was now holding the result in her arms. And the result was a baby who needed to be fed and changed and rocked to sleep. A baby who cried and squirmed and grasped her finger with his tiny hand. A baby who was, according to the angel, the Son of the Most High, the occupant of David's throne, the ruler of an endless kingdom. The gap between what the angel said and what Mary saw must have been staggering. The Son of the Most High was hungry. The king of an endless kingdom needed his mother's breast. The one who would save his people from their sins could not yet hold up his own head. Mary held divinity in her arms, and divinity needed to be burped. The incarnation, at this stage, was less a theology and more a daily reality of interrupted sleep and sore nipples, and the constant animal vigilance of a new mother whose body was still recovering from the birth. 8 days later, the child was circumcised and named Jesus, just as the angel had instructed. The naming was Joseph's act, and by performing it, he completed the legal adoption that the angel had commissioned. The child was now, in the eyes of the law, the son of Joseph, the son of David, the heir to a throne that had been vacant for 6 centuries, but that the prophets insisted would be filled again. The baby in the manger was, on paper, a prince. In reality, he was a refugee in the making. When Mary and Joseph brought the child to the temple in Jerusalem for the rites of purification prescribed by the law, they encountered an old man named Simeon, who had been told by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. Simeon took the baby in his arms and blessed God, saying, "Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel, a light for the Gentiles." The phrase reaches backward through the genealogy, touching Tamar the Canaanite, Rahab the Canaanite, Ruth the Moabite, each of them a Gentile woman woven into the story of Israel's God, each of them a preview of the moment when the scope of salvation would expand beyond the borders of one nation to encompass the entire world. Simeon saw it in the face of a 6-week-old baby. The Gentile women in the genealogy had lived it, centuries before the baby was born. But Simeon was not finished. He turned to Mary and said something that must have fallen on her like a shadow. "Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed, and a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed." A sword will pierce your own soul. The promise was specific and devastating. Mary's joy, her wonder, her treasuring and pondering would be accompanied by a pain so sharp that Simeon compared it to a blade passing through the center of her being. He did not say when. He did not say how. He left the wound in the future, undefined, waiting. A prophecy that Mary would carry with her for 30 years before she understood, standing at the foot of a Roman cross, watching her son die, what the old man in the temple had meant. Mary carried all of this. She carried the angel's message and Elizabeth's greeting and Joseph's quiet faithfulness and the shepherd's wonder and Simeon's sword. She carried a child who was both hers and not hers, a son she had nursed and raised and taught to walk and talk and read the scriptures, a son who would one day stand in a synagogue and read from the scroll of Isaiah and say, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And the people who had known him since he was a boy would try to throw him off a cliff. She carried the knowledge that she had been chosen, and the knowledge that being chosen did not mean being spared. It meant being pierced. It meant standing at the intersection of the human and the divine, and feeling in your own body the cost of holding both together. She is the last woman in Matthew's genealogy, and she is the most different from the others, and she is also the most similar. She did not deceive anyone, as Tamar did. She did not practice prostitution, as Rahab had. She did not come from a forbidden nation, as Ruth had. She was not taken by a king, as Bathsheba was. Her scandal was of a different order entirely. Not a scandal of sin, but a scandal of grace. Not a transgression that needed forgiving, but a miracle that needed believing. And yet the shape of her story fits the pattern that the genealogy has been building, name by name, woman by woman, from the beginning. A woman in an impossible situation. A pregnancy that cannot be explained by the normal rules. A future that depends on someone choosing the harder path. The path that looks wrong from the outside. The path that requires a faith so deep it is indistinguishable to the casual observer from madness. Mary said yes. She said it in Nazareth to an angel when she was young enough that the full weight of what she was agreeing to could not possibly have been clear to her. She said it again, implicitly. Every day that the pregnancy progressed and the whispers grew louder and the explanations grew thinner. She said it in Bethlehem, in a stable, in pain, laying her firstborn son in a trough because there was no room in the inn. She said it in the temple, when an old man told her a sword would pierce her soul. She would go on saying it for the rest of her life, through the years of obscurity in Nazareth and the years of public ministry and the final terrible hours in Jerusalem, when the sword Simeon had promised fell at last, and the son she had carried in her body was nailed to a piece of wood and lifted up for the world to see. But all of that was still in the future. For now, in Bethlehem, in the quiet after the shepherds had gone home and the angels had returned to wherever angels go, Mary held her son and pondered. She did not know everything. She knew enough. She knew that the child in her arms was not like other children, that his arrival had been announced by an angel, that his conception was a mystery she could describe but not explain, that his future was tangled with the future of nations and the purposes of a God whose ways she was only beginning to understand. She knew that she had been chosen, and that the choosing had cost her the simple life she might otherwise have lived, the uncomplicated marriage, the unremarkable pregnancy, and the ordinary joys of a young woman in a small village who had never been visited by anything more extraordinary than the change of seasons. She had traded all of that for this, a manger, a mystery, and a child who would grow up to change everything. The genealogy that Matthew constructed, the long list of fathers and sons with its 5 strange female interruptions, ends here, in this room, with this mother, with this child. The line that began with Abraham, that narrowed through Judah and widened through Tamar, that passed through a prostitute's house in Jericho and a threshing floor in Bethlehem and a rooftop in Jerusalem, arrives at last at the place it was always heading. 5 women, separated by centuries, united by a pattern they could not see, had each played their part in carrying the thread forward. and now the thread had reached its destination, wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger, breathing the cold night air of Bethlehem for the first time. But the story of the five, considered together and considered as a single argument woven across generations, is more than the sum of its parts. The pattern they form, the theology they embody, the God they reveal, is something that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see all five at once, to see the shape of what Matthew was building when he placed their names, one by one, into a list that had no room for them and could not, it turns out, exist without them. Stand far enough away from a tapestry, and you stop seeing the individual threads. You see the picture. You see what the weaver intended, the image that was invisible when your nose was pressed against the fabric, and all you could see was knot after knot after knot, each one separate, each one a tiny act of labor that meant nothing on its own and everything in sequence. The five women in Matthew's genealogy are like that. Taken individually, each story is complete in itself, self-contained, a narrative with its own characters and tensions and resolutions that can be read and understood without reference to the others. Tamar's confrontation with Judah does not require knowledge of Rahab's decision in Jericho. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi does not depend on Bathsheba's tragedy. Mary's Annunciation stands on its own, needing nothing from the four who preceded her to carry its weight. But Matthew did not present them individually. He placed them together, in sequence, in a single list, separated by generations but connected by something that only becomes visible when you stop looking at the threads and start looking at the picture. The first thing the picture reveals is a God who is not embarrassed by his own story. Any competent editor, handed the genealogy of the Messiah and told to make it presentable, would have removed the five women immediately. They complicate the narrative. They raise questions that are easier to leave unasked. They introduce elements of scandal, foreignness, and moral ambiguity into a record that was supposed to establish legitimacy, and legitimacy, in the ancient world, as in the modern one, thrives on simplicity and suffocates in complexity. A clean genealogy, father to son, unblemished by the presence of prostitutes and foreigners and women who seduced their fathers-in-law, would have been far more useful as a legal document, far more persuasive as a political argument, far more comfortable as a piece of religious literature. Matthew could have written one. He chose not to. The choice implies a theology. If you believe that God controls the story, that the messianic line was not an accident of biology but a guided process stretching across 2,000 years of human history, then the presence of these five women is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. God did not include them because he had no other options. The line could have run through different women, different marriages, different circumstances. It could have been clean. It could have been respectable. It could have been the kind of lineage that a priest would recite with pride and a king would display on the wall of his throne room. Instead, it ran through a Canaanite who played the harlot, a Canaanite who was a harlot, a Moabite who crossed an uncrossable border, an Israelite whose husband was murdered by her second husband, and a virgin whose pregnancy was indistinguishable to any outside observer from the ordinary kind of scandal. The God who arranged this genealogy was not trying to produce a document that would impress a credentials committee. He was making a statement about the kind of God he is. The second thing the picture reveals is a consistent pattern of reversal. In every case, the woman's story involves a moment where the expected outcome is overturned, where the person who should have been excluded is included, where the normal rules produce a dead end, and the path forward requires something that the rules did not anticipate. Tamar should have been forgotten, an abandoned widow in her father's house, erased from the line of Judah by a patriarch who valued his surviving son more than his obligation to her. Instead, she engineered her own inclusion, and Judah himself declared her righteous. Rahab should have died with her city, consumed in the fire that took every other living thing in Jericho, a nameless casualty in a divinely commanded destruction. Instead, she saw what the kings of the earth could not see, and a scarlet cord in a window became the difference between annihilation and ancestry. Ruth should have been turned back at the border, returned to Moab by the logic of the law and the bitterness of her mother-in-law. Instead, she refused to leave, and her refusal became the foundation of the royal line. Bathsheba should have been a footnote, a victim of royal power, a woman whose story began and ended with a crime committed against her. Instead, she outlived the crime, raised the wisest king Israel ever knew, and intervened at the critical moment to ensure that the right son sat on the throne. Mary should have been divorced quietly, sent away by a just man who could not bring himself to believe the impossible. Instead, an angel spoke in the night, and the just man chose faith over reason, and the child, who should not have existed by any human calculation, became the child around whom all of human history would pivot. In every case, the reversal follows the same shape. A dead end becomes a doorway. A disqualification becomes a qualification. The thing that should have stopped the story is the thing that drives it forward. And the agent of the reversal is never the powerful, the connected, the institutionally approved figure who stands at the center of the system. The agent is always the marginal one, the outsider, the woman who has no standing and no leverage and no reason to believe that her actions will amount to anything, acting out of desperation or loyalty or courage or some combination of all three that defies easy categorization. This is not how power usually works. Power usually works from the top down. Kings issue decrees. Armies conquer cities. Priests perform rituals. Prophets deliver oracles. The machinery of history is operated by people who have titles and positions and the authority that comes from being recognized by the system as someone who matters. The 5 women in Matthew's genealogy had none of these things. Tamar was a discarded daughter-in-law. Rahab was a prostitute living in a wall. Ruth was a penniless immigrant, gleaning in a stranger's field. Bathsheba was a woman whose agency, at least at the beginning of her story, was effectively zero. Mary was a teenager in a village that the empire had never heard of. They had no power, no platform, no voice in the councils where decisions were made. And yet, the decisions that mattered most, the decisions on which the entire messianic line depended, were made by them. In rooms, and on roads, and on rooftops, and in fields, far from the places where history was supposedly being written, these women wrote it. The third thing the picture reveals is a God who has a consistent posture toward the boundary lines that human beings construct. Every culture draws lines, inside and outside, clean and unclean, us and them, acceptable and unacceptable. The lines are necessary. Without them, communities dissolve into chaos, and identity becomes meaningless. Israel's lines were not arbitrary. They were given by God Himself, codified in the law of Moses, reinforced by centuries of prophetic teaching. The distinction between Israel and the nations was real and important and divinely ordained. The prohibition against Moabites entering the assembly was not a human invention, it was Scripture. The command to destroy the Canaanites was not a cultural preference, it was a divine order. The lines were real, and God, apparently, reserved the right to cross them. 3 of the 5 women were from the wrong side of the most important boundary Israel possessed, the boundary between the covenant people and everyone else. Tamar was a Canaanite. Rahab was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabite. Each came from a people that the law of Israel regarded with suspicion or outright hostility, and each was absorbed into the covenant community not by erasing her identity, but by bringing it with her, foreign name and all, into the genealogy of the Messiah. God did not sneak them in through the back door. He put their names in the front of the book. The implication is not that the boundary lines were wrong. The implication is that the boundary lines were not the final word. The law drew a circle and said, "These are God's people." The genealogy drew a larger circle and said, "Yes, but God's people include some surprises." The tension between the two is never fully resolved in the Old Testament. It sits there, humming with energy, waiting for the moment in the New Testament when Peter will have a vision of unclean animals and hear a voice saying, "What God has made clean, do not call common," and the boundary between Jew and Gentile will be formally and permanently redrawn. The 5 women in the genealogy are the tremors before that earthquake. They are the evidence, hidden in plain sight, that God was always planning to widen the circle, and that the plan was not an afterthought, but a feature, woven into the messianic line from the generation of Judah onward. The 4th thing the picture reveals is a persistent refusal to sanitize. Matthew could have mentioned these women without drawing attention to the most uncomfortable aspects of their stories. He could have called Rahab by name without mentioning her profession. He could have called Bathsheba by name without mentioning her husband. He could have mentioned Ruth without evoking the Moabite stigma. He did none of these things. He named Rahab, and every first-century Jewish reader knew what she was. He called Bathsheba the wife of Uriah, and every first-century Jewish reader knew what that meant. He identified Ruth as a Moabite, and every first-century Jewish reader felt the weight of the prohibition. The uncomfortable details were not suppressed. They were foregrounded. Matthew wanted his readers to feel the discomfort, because the discomfort was the point. The Messiah's family tree was not a monument to human virtue. It was a monument to divine persistence, to a God who kept the line going through circumstances that would have killed any merely human enterprise, not by finding perfect people to carry it, but by using the people who were available, with all their imperfections, all their scandals, all their histories that a respectable family would prefer to keep in the attic. And this leads to the 5th and most important thing the picture reveals: a theology of incarnation that begins long before Bethlehem. The incarnation, in Christian theology, is the moment when God became human, when the divine entered the material world, when the transcendent took on flesh and blood and bone and moved into the neighborhood. It is traditionally located at the moment of Jesus' conception or birth, the instant when the Word became flesh. But the genealogy suggests that the incarnation was not a sudden eruption into a clean system. It was the culmination of a long, slow process in which God had been getting his hands dirty for generations. The God who became a baby in a manger was the same God who worked through a woman's deception on the road to Timnah, through a prostitute's lie on a rooftop in Jericho, through a widow's midnight visit to a threshing floor, through the wreckage of a king's adultery and a soldier's murder. The incarnation did not begin in a stable. It began in the genealogy. It began in the mess. It began the moment God decided that the line through which his Son would enter the world would run, not through marble halls and immaculate records, but through the tangled, stained, gloriously imperfect history of actual human beings doing the best they could in circumstances that were rarely ideal and sometimes appalling. The 5 women are the proof that God was never working with clean materials. He was working with what he had, and what he had, it turns out, was enough. Consider one more thing about these 5 women, something that is easy to miss because it is so quiet, so woven into the texture of the stories that it almost passes without notice. None of them knew. Not one of the five, at the moment of her decisive action, knew that she was building the genealogy of the Christ. Tamar, sitting by the road in her veil, was thinking about justice, about the child she was owed, about the future that Judah had stolen from her. She was not thinking about a Messiah who would be born 1,000 years later. Rahab, hiding the spies under the flax, was thinking about survival, about her family, about the God whose reputation had preceded him across the desert. She was not calculating her position in a genealogy that had not yet been written. Ruth, following Naomi along the road from Moab, was thinking about loyalty, about the old woman she loved, about the God she was choosing almost blindly, on the basis of almost nothing. She was not considering her eventual connection to a throne that did not yet exist. Bathsheba, standing in the ruins of her first marriage, watching her first child die, did not know that her second son would build the temple, and that the temple's true fulfillment would be a descendant of hers, lying in a feeding trough in the town where she had become a queen. And Mary, saying yes to the angel, knew the most of the five, knew that the child would be called the Son of the Most High and would sit on the throne of David. But even she did not know what that would look like, what it would cost, where the road that began with Gabriel's greeting would end. They acted in the dark. They chose without full information. They committed themselves to outcomes they could not predict, based on convictions they could not fully articulate, driven by a combination of desperation and hope and stubbornness, and something that can only be called faith, though the word is too small for the thing it describes. Faith is a word for trusting what you cannot see. What these women did was more than trust. They walked into the invisible and made it real. They took the raw materials of their broken, compromised, marginalized lives and built, without knowing they were building, the road on which the Son of God would enter the world. Matthew knew what they did not. He had the advantage of retrospect, the ability to stand at the end of the genealogy and look back along the line and see the pattern that was invisible to the women who lived inside it. And what he saw was enough to make him break the rules of genealogical composition, to insert 5 female names into a patriarchal list, to crack the smooth surface of the record and let the light shine through the cracks. He saw that the story of salvation was not a story of human achievement, but a story of divine stubbornness, a story about a God who refused to give up on a line that human beings kept compromising, who kept finding ways to move the promise forward through people who would never have been selected by a committee, who seemed, in fact, to prefer the unlikely candidate, the disqualified applicant, the person standing at the edge of the crowd, wondering if they were even allowed to be there. The genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. 42 generations, 5 women. A thread that runs through scandal and survival, through foreign lands and forbidden unions, through deception and loyalty and grief, and an impossible pregnancy in a nowhere town. The thread is not clean. It was never clean. And that, Matthew is saying, is the gospel. Not that God found worthy people and used them, but that God found people in all their unworthiness and made them part of the most important story ever told. The 5 women did not know they were part of that story. They knew only what was in front of them: a road, a wall, a field, a rooftop, a room. And in each of those places, with nothing to guide them but the fierce, inarticulate conviction that the next step mattered even if they could not see where it led, they took that step, and the step carried them into a genealogy. And the genealogy carried them into a gospel. And the gospel carried them into the permanent memory of a world that would never stop telling their stories, never stop arguing about what their stories mean, and never, despite 2,000 years of trying, fully exhaust the mystery of why these 5, why these women, Why this God? The angel has departed. The shepherds have gone home. The manger is quiet. And somewhere in the silence, if you listen, you can hear the thread still humming, still pulling, still running forward through the generations, through the scandal and the grace, through the mess and the miracle, carrying something precious toward a destination that none of the women who held it could see, but all of them, in their own way, believed was there. The names are in the book. They were always in the book. And the book is still being read.